Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Excuse me, Professor Thompson. I know your office hours are tomorrow, but I was wondering if you had a few minutes free now to discuss something.
Sure, John. What did you want to talk about?
Well, I have some quick questions about how to write up the research project I did this semester about climate variations.
Oh, yes. You were looking at variations in climate in the Grant City area, right? How far along have you gotten?
I've got all my data, so I'm starting to summarize it now, preparing graphs and stuff. But I'm looking at it and I'm afraid that it's not enough. But I'm not sure what else to put in the report.
I hear the same thing from every student. You know, you have to remember now that you're the expert on what you've done. So think about what you'd need to include if you were going to explain your research project to someone with general or casual knowledge about the subject, like your parents. That's usually my rule of thumb. Would my parents understand this?
Okay, I get it.
I hope you can recognize by my saying that how much you do know about the subject.
Right, I understand. I was wondering if I should also include the notes from the research journal you suggested I keep.
Yes, definitely. You should use them to indicate what your evolution and thought was through time. So just set up, what was the purpose of what you were doing, to try to understand the climate variability of this area, and what you did and what your approach was.
Okay, so for example, I studied meteorological records. I looked at climate charts. I used different methods for analyzing the data, like certain statistical tests, and then I discussed the results. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's right. You should include all of that. The statistical tests are especially important. And also, be sure you include a good reference section where all your published and unpublished data came from, because you have a lot of unpublished climate data.
Something just came into my mind and went out the other side.
That happens to me a lot, so I've come up with a pretty good memory management tool. I carry a little pad with me all the time and jot down questions or ideas that I don't want to forget. For example, I went to the doctor with my daughter and her baby son last week, and we knew we wouldn't remember everything we wanted to ask the doctor, so we actually made a list of 5 things we wanted answers to.
A notepad is a good idea. Since I'm so busy now at the end of the semester, I'm getting pretty forgetful these days. Okay, I just remembered what I was trying to say before.
Good. I was hoping you'd come up with it.
Yes, it ends up that I have data on more than just the immediate Grant City area, so I also included some regional data in the report. With everything else, it should be a pretty good indicator of the climate in this part of the state.
Sounds good. I'd be happy to look over a draft version before you hand in the final copy if you wish.
Great. I'll plan to get you a draft of the paper by next Friday. Thanks very much. Well, see ya.
Okay.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
You have to remember now that you're the expert on what you've done. So think about what you'd need to include if you were going to explain your research project to someone with general or casual knowledge about the subject, like your parents. That's usually my rule of thumb. Would my parents understand this?
Okay, I get it.
I hope you can recognize by my saying that how much you do know about the subject.
Why does the professor say this?
I hope you can recognize by my saying that how much you do know about the subject.
Listen to part of a lecture in a philosophy class.
Okay, another ancient Greek philosopher we need to discuss is Aristotle. Aristotle's ethical theory. What Aristotle's ethical theory is all about is this. He's trying to show you how to be happy, what true happiness is. Now, why is he interested in human happiness? It's not just because it's something that all people want or aim for. It's more than that. But to get there, we need to first make a very important distinction. Let me introduce a couple of technical terms: extrinsic value and intrinsic value. To understand Aristotle's interest in happiness, you need to understand this distinction. Some things we aim for and value not for themselves, but for what they bring about, in addition to themselves. If I value something as a means to something else, then it has what we will call extrinsic value. Other things we desire and hold to be valuable for themselves alone. If we value something not as a means to something else, but for its own sake, let us say that it has intrinsic value. Exercise. There may be some people who value exercise for itself, but I don't. I value exercise because if I exercise, I tend to stay healthier than I would if I didn't. So I desire to engage in exercise, and I value exercise extrinsically, not for its own sake, but as a means to something beyond it. It brings me good health. Health. Why do I value good health? Well, here it gets a little more complicated for me. Health is important for me because I can't do other things I want to do, play music, teach philosophy, if I'm ill. So health is important to me, has value to me as a means to a productive life. But health is also important to me because I just kind of like to be healthy. It feels good. It's pleasant to be healthy, unpleasant not to be. So to some degree, I value health both for itself and as a means to something else, productivity. It's got extrinsic and intrinsic value for me. Then there's some things that are just valued for themselves. I'm a musician, not a professional musician. I just play a musical instrument for fun. Why do I value playing music? Well, like most amateur musicians, I only play because, well, I just enjoy it. It's something that's an end in itself. Now, something else I value is teaching. Why? Well, it brings in a modest income, but I could make more money doing other things. I'd do it even if they didn't pay me. I just enjoy teaching. In that sense, it's an end to itself. But teaching's not something that has intrinsic value for all people. And that's true generally. Most things that are enjoyed in and of themselves vary from person to person. Some people value teaching intrinsically, but others don't. So how does all this relate to human happiness? Well, Aristotle asks, is there something that all human beings value, and value only intrinsically, for its own sake and only for its own sake? If you could find such a thing, that would be the universal final good, or truly the ultimate purpose or goal for all human beings. Aristotle thought the answer was yes. What is it? Happiness. Everyone will agree, he argues, that happiness is the ultimate end, to be valued for itself, and really only for itself. For what other purpose is there in being happy? What does it yield? The attainment of happiness becomes the ultimate or highest good for Aristotle. The next question that Aristotle raises is, what is happiness? We all want it, we all desire it, we all seek it. It's the goal we have in life. But what is it? How do we find it? Here, he notes, with some frustration, people disagree. But he does give us a couple of criteria or features to keep in mind as we look for what true human happiness is. True human happiness should be, as he puts it, complete. Complete in that it's all we require. Well, true human happiness, if you had that, what else do you need? Nothing. And second, true happiness should be something that I can obtain on my own. I shouldn't have to rely on other people for it. Many people value fame and seek fame. Fame for them becomes the goal. But according to Aristotle, this won't work either, because fame depends altogether too much on other people. I can't get it on my own without help from other people. In the end, Aristotle says that true happiness is the exercise of reason, a life of intellectual contemplation, of thinking. So let's see how he comes to that.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Now, something else I value is teaching. Why? Well, it brings in a modest income, but I could make more money doing other things.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Well, it brings in a modest income, but I could make more money doing other things.
Listen to part of a psychology lecture. The professor is discussing behaviorism.
Now, many people consider John Watson to be the founder of behaviorism, and like other behaviorists, he believed that psychologists should study only the behaviors they can observe and measure. They're not interested in mental processes. While a person could describe his thoughts, no one else can see or hear them to verify the accuracy of his report. But one thing you can observe is muscular habits. What Watson did was to observe muscular habits because he viewed them as a manifestation of thinking. One kind of habit that he studied are laryngeal habits. Watson thought laryngeal habits, from larynx, in other words, related to the voice box. He thought those habits were an expression of thinking. He argued that for very young children, thinking is really talking out loud to oneself, because they talk out loud even if they're not trying to communicate with someone in particular. As the individual matures, that overt talking to oneself becomes covert talking to oneself. But thinking still shows up as a laryngeal habit. One of the bits of evidence that supports this is that when people are trying to solve a problem, they typically have increased muscular activity in the throat region. That is, if you put electrodes on the throat and measure muscle potential, muscle activity, you discover that when people are thinking, like if they're diligently trying to solve a problem, that there is muscular activity in the throat region. So Watson made the argument that problem solving, or thinking, can be defined as a set of behaviors, a set of responses. And in this case, the response he observed was the throat activity. And that's what he means when he calls it a laryngeal habit. Now, as I am thinking about what I'm going to be saying, my muscles in my throat are responding. So thinking can be measured as muscle activity. Now, the motor theory... Yes?
Professor Blake, did he happen to look at people who sign? I mean, deaf people?
He did indeed. And to jump ahead, what one finds in deaf individuals who use sign language, when they're given problems of various kinds, they have muscular changes in their hands when they're trying to solve a problem. Muscle changes in the hand, just like the muscular changes going on in the throat region for speaking individuals. So, for Watson, thinking is identical with the activity of muscles. A related concept of thinking was developed by William James. It's called ideomotor action. Ideomotor action is an activity that occurs without our noticing it, without our being aware of it. I'll give you one simple example. If you think of locations, there tends to be eye movement that occurs with your thinking about that location. In particular, from where we're sitting, imagine that you're asked to think of our university library. Well, if you close your eyes and think of the library, and if you're sitting directly facing me, then according to this notion, your eyeballs will move slightly to the left, to your left, because the library's in that general direction. James and others said that this is an idea leading to a motor action, and that's why it's called ideomotor action. An idea leads to motor activity. If you wish to impress your friends and relatives, you can change this simple process into a magic trick. Ask people to do something such as I've just described. Think of something on their left. Think of something on their right. You get them to think about two things on either side with their eyes closed, and you watch their eyes very carefully. And if you do that, you'll discover that you can see rather clearly the eye movement. That is, you can see the movement of the eyeballs. Now, then you say, think of either one, and I'll tell you which you're thinking of. Okay, well, Watson makes the assumption that muscular activity is equivalent to thinking. But given everything we've been talking about here, one has to ask, are there alternatives to this motor theory, this claim that muscular activities are equivalent to thinking? Is there anything else that might account for this change in muscular activity other than saying that it is thinking? And the answer is clearly yes. Is there any way to answer the question definitively? I think the answer is no.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Watson thought laryngeal habits, from larynx, in other words, related to the voice box. He thought those habits were an expression of thinking.
Why does the professor say this?
From larynx, in other words, related to the voice box.
Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class. You will not need to remember the numbers the professor mentions.
Okay, let's get going. Today I'm going to talk about how the asteroid belt was discovered. And I'm going to start by writing some numbers on the board. Here they are. We'll start with 0, then 3, 6, 12. Tell me what I'm doing.
Multiplying by 2?
Right. I'm doubling the numbers, so 2 times 12 is 24, and the next one I'm going to write after 24 would be
48.
48. Then 96. We'll stop there for now. Now I'll write another row of numbers under that. Tell me what I'm doing. 4, 7, 10. How am I getting this second row?
Adding 4 to the numbers in the first row.
I'm adding 4 to each number in the first row to give you a second row. So the last two will be 52, 100, and now tell me what I'm doing.
Putting in a decimal?
Yes, I divided all those numbers by 10 by putting in a decimal point. Now I'm going to write the names of the planets under the numbers. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars. So what do the numbers mean? Do you remember from the reading?
Is it the distance of the planets from the sun?
Right, in astronomical units. Not perfect, but tantalizingly close. The value for Mars is off by 6 or 7% or so. But it's within 10% of the average distance to Mars from the sun. But I kind of have to skip the one after Mars for now. Then Jupiter's right there at 5 point something, and then Saturn is about 10 astronomical units from the sun. Well, this pattern is known as Bode's law. It isn't really a scientific law, not in the sense of predicting gravitation mathematically or something, but it's attempting a pattern in the spacing of the planets, and it was noticed by Bode hundreds of years ago. Well, you can imagine that there was some interest in why the 2.8 spot in the pattern was skipped. But there wasn't anything obvious there in the early telescopes. Then, what happened in the late 1700s? The discovery of...
Another planet?
The next planet out, Uranus, after Saturn. And look, Uranus fits in the next spot in the pattern pretty nicely. Not perfectly, but close. And so then people got really excited about the validity of this thing and finding the missing object between Mars and Jupiter. And telescopes, remember, were getting better. So people went to work on finding objects that would be at that missing distance from the sun. And then in 1801, the object Ceres was discovered. And Ceres was in the right place, the missing spot. But it was way too faint to be a planet. It looked like a little star. And because of its star-like appearance, it was called an asteroid. Okay? Aster is Greek for star, as in astronomy. And so Ceres was the first and is the largest of what became many objects discovered at that same distance. Not just one thing, but all the objects found at that distance form the asteroid belt. So the asteroid belt is the most famous success of this Bode's law. That's how the asteroid belt was discovered.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Well, this pattern is known as Bode's law. It isn't really a scientific law, not in the sense of predicting gravitation mathematically or something, but it's attempting a pattern in the spacing of the planets, and it was noticed by Bode hundreds of years ago.
Why does the professor say this?
Not in the sense of predicting gravitation mathematically or something.
Listen to part of a lecture from a botany class.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all today. Actually, I expected the population to be a lot lower today. It typically runs between 50 and 60% on the day the research paper is due. I I was hoping to have your exams back today, but the situation was that I went away for the weekend, and I was supposed to get in yesterday at 5, and I expected to fully complete all the exams by midnight or so, which is the time that I usually go to bed, but my flight was delayed, and I ended up not getting in until 1 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, I'll do my best to have them finished by the next time we meet. Okay, in the last class we started talking about useful plant fibers. In particular, we talked about cotton fibers, which we said were very useful not only in the textile industry, but also in the chemical industry and in the production of many products, such as plastics, paper, explosives, and so on. Today we'll continue talking about useful fibers, and we'll begin with a fiber that's commonly known as manila hemp. Now, for some strange reason, many people believe that manila hemp is a hemp plant, but manila hemp is not really hemp. It's actually a member of the banana family. It even bears little banana-shaped fruits. The manila part of the name makes sense because manila hemp is produced chiefly in the Philippine Islands, and of course, the capital city of the Philippines is Manila. Now, as fibers go, manila hemp fibers are very long. They can easily be several feet in length. And they're also very strong, very flexible. They have one more characteristic that's very important, and that is that they are exceptionally resistant to salt water. And this combination of characteristics, long, strong, flexible, resistant to salt water, makes manila hemp a great material for ropes, especially for ropes that are going to be used on ocean-going ships. In fact, by the early 1940s, even though steel cables were available, most ships in the United States Navy were not moored with steel cables. They were moored with manila hemp ropes. Now, why was that? Well, the main reason was that steel cables degrade very, very quickly in contact with salt water. If you've ever been to San Francisco, you know that the Golden Gate Bridge is red. And it's red because of the zinc paint that goes on those stainless steel cables. That if they start at one end of the bridge and they work to the other end, by the time they finish, it's already time to go back and start painting the beginning of the bridge again. Because the bridge was built with steel cables, and steel cables can't take the salt air unless they're treated repeatedly with a zinc-based paint. On the other hand, plant products like manila hemp, you can drag through the ocean for weeks on end. If you want to tie your anchor to it and drop it right into the ocean, that's no problem, because plant fibers can stand up for months, even years, in direct contact with salt water. Okay, so how do you take plant fibers that individually you could break with your hands and turn them into a rope that's strong enough to moor a ship that weighs thousands of tons? Well, what you do is extract these long fibers from the manila hemp plant, and then you take several of these fibers and you group them into a bundle, because by grouping the fibers you greatly increase their breaking strength. That bundle of fibers is much stronger than any of the individual fibers that compose it. And then you take that bundle of fibers and you twist it a little bit, because by twisting it, you increase its breaking strength even more. And then you take several of these little bundles and you group and twist them into bigger bundles, which you then group and twist into even bigger bundles, and so on, until eventually you end up with a very, very strong rope.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I was hoping to have your exams back today, but the situation was that I went away for the weekend, and I was supposed to get in yesterday at 5, and I expected to fully complete all the exams by midnight or so, which is the time that I usually go to bed, but my flight was delayed, and I ended up not getting in until 1 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, I'll do my best to have them finished by the next time we meet.
Why does the professor mention going away for the weekend? Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hey, Ellen, how are you doing?
Oh, pretty good, thanks. How are you?
Okay.
Did you have a chance to look at my grad school application? You know, the statement of purpose I wrote?
Well, yeah, in fact, here it is. I just read it.
Oh, great. What did you think?
Basically, it's good. What you might actually do is take some of these different points here and actually break them out into separate paragraphs. So, 1, your purpose for applying for graduate study. Why do you want to go to graduate school and an area of specialty, and why you want to do the area you're specifying, and what you want to do with your degree once you get it.
Okay.
So those are they're pretty clear on those 4 points they want.
Right.
So you might just break them out into, separate paragraphs and expand on each point some. But really what's critical with these is that you've got to let yourself come through. See, you got to let them see you in these statements. Expand some more on what's happened in your own life and what shows your motivation and interest in this area, in geology. Let them see what captures your imagination about this field.
Okay, so make it a little more personal. That's okay?
That's fine. They look for that stuff. You don't want to go overboard,
right.
But it's critical that somebody sees what your passion is, your personal motivation for doing this.
Okay.
And that's got to come out in here. And let's see, you might also give a little, since this is your only chance to do it, you might give a little more explanation about your unique undergraduate background. So, how you went through, the music program, what you got from that. Why you decided to change. I mean, it's kind of unusual to go from music to geology, right?
Yeah, I was afraid that, maybe the personal type stuff wouldn't be what they wanted, but...
No, in fact, it's... give an example. I had a friend when I was an undergrad, went to medical school, and he put on his med school application, and he could actually tell if somebody actually read it, because he had asthma, and the reason that he wanted to go to med school was he said he wanted to do sports medicine because he had this real interest. He was an athlete too, and wanted to help athletes who had this physical problem. And he could always tell if somebody actually read his letter because they would always ask him about that.
So something unique.
Yeah. So see, that's what's good. And I think for you probably, your music background's the most unique thing that you've got in your record.
Right.
So you see, you got to make yourself stand out from a couple of hundred applications. Does that help any?
Yeah, it does. It gives me some good ideas.
And what you might also do, too, is, you might get a friend to proof it or something at some point.
Oh, sure.
Also, think about presentation, how the application looks. In a way, you're actually showing some other skills here, like organization. A lot of stuff that they're not formally asking for, they're looking at. So your presentation format, your grammar, all that stuff, they're looking at in your materials at the same time.
Right. Okay.
Listen to part of a talk in an environmental science class.
So I wanted to discuss a few other terms here. Actually, some ideas about how we manage our resources. Let's talk about what that means. If we take a resource like water, well, maybe we should get a little bit more specific here, back up from the more general case, and talk about underground water in particular. So, hydrogeologists have tried to figure out how much water can you take out from underground sources? This has been an important question. Let me ask you guys, how much water, based on what you know so far, could you take out of, say, an aquifer under the city?
As much as would get recharged?
Okay. So we wouldn't want to take out any more than naturally comes into it. The implication is that, if you only take as much out as comes in, you're not going to deplete the amount of water that's stored in there, right? Wrong. But that's the principle. That's the idea behind how we manage our water supplies. It's called safe yield. Basically, what this method says is that you can pump as much water out of a system as naturally recharges, as naturally flows back in. So this principle of safe yield, it's based on balancing what we take out with what gets recharged. But what it does is it ignores how much water naturally comes out of the system. In a natural system, a certain amount of recharge comes in, and a certain amount of water naturally flows out through springs, streams, and lakes. And over the long term, the amount that's stored in the aquifer doesn't really change much. It's balanced. Now humans come in and start taking water out of the system. How have we changed the equation?
It's not balanced anymore?
Right. We take water out, but water also naturally flows out. And the recharge rate doesn't change. So the result is we've reduced the amount of water that's stored in the underground system. If you keep doing that long enough, if you pump as much water out as naturally comes in, gradually the underground water levels drop. And when that happens, that can affect surface water. How? Well, in underground systems, there are natural discharge points, places where the water flows out of the underground systems, out to lakes and streams. Well, a drop in the water level can mean those discharge points will eventually dry up. That means water's not getting to lakes and streams that depend on it. So we've ended up reducing the surface water supply, too. You know, in the state of Arizona, we're managing some major water supplies with this principle of safe yield, under a method that will eventually dry up the natural discharge points of those aquifer systems. Now, why is this an issue? Well, aren't some of you going to want to live in this state for a while? Want your kids to grow up here and your kids' kids? You might be concerned with, does Arizona have a water supply which is sustainable? Key word here. What that means, the general definition of sustainable is, will there be enough to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future to have the availability to have the same resources? Now, I hope you see that these two ideas are incompatible, sustainability and safe yield. Because what sustainability means is that it's sustainable for all systems dependent on the water, for the people that use it, and for supplying water to the dependent lakes and streams. So I'm going to repeat this. So if we're using a safe yield method, if we're only balancing what we take out with what gets recharged, but don't forget, water's also flowing out naturally, then the amount stored underground is going to gradually get reduced, and that's going to lead to another problem. These discharge points, where the water flows out to the lakes and streams, they're going to dry up. Okay.
Why does the professor say this?
Now, why is this an issue? Well, aren't some of you going to want to live in this state for a while? Want your kids to grow up here and your kids' kids?
Listen to part of a conversation between two students. The woman is helping the man review for a biology examination.
Okay, so what do you think we should go over next?
How about if we go over this stuff about how bacteria become resistant to antibiotics?
Okay.
But first of all, though, how many pages do we have left? I told my roommate I'd meet her at the library at 7 o'clock.
There's only a few pages left. We should be finished in a few minutes.
Okay. So,
about how bacteria become resistant to antibiotics.
Oh, yeah, okay. So you know that some bacteria cells are able to resist the drugs we use against them, and that's because they have these special genes that, protect them from the drugs.
Right. If I remember correctly, I think the genes, weaken the antibiotics or, stop the antibiotics from getting into the bacteria cell, something like that?
Exactly. So when bacteria have these genes, it's very difficult for the antibiotics to kill the bacteria.
Right.
So, do you remember what those genes are called? Resistance genes.
Resistance genes, right. Resistance genes, okay.
And that makes sense, right? Because they help the bacteria resist the antibiotics.
Yeah, that makes sense, okay.
Okay, but the question is, how do bacteria get the resistance genes?
How do they get the resistance genes? They just inherit them from the parent cell, right?
Okay, yeah, that's true. They can inherit them from the parent cell, but that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm talking about how they get resistance genes from other cells in their environment. You know, from the other cells around them.
Oh, I see what you mean. Is that stuff about hopping genes or something like that?
Right, although actually they're called jumping genes, not hopping genes.
Oh, okay. Jumping genes.
Yeah, but they have another name, too, that I can't think of. Let me see if I can find it here in the book.
I think it's probably on...
Oh, okay, here it is. Transposons. That's what they're called.
Let me see. Okay. Transposons. So, transposon is another name for a jumping gene?
Right. And these transposons are, like little bits of DNA that are able to move from one cell to another. That's why they're called jumping genes. They kind of jump from one cell to another.
Okay.
And these transposons are how resistance genes are able to get from one bacteria cell to another bacteria cell. What happens is that a resistance gene from one cell attaches itself to a transposon, and then when the transposon jumps to another cell,
the other cell gets the resistance gene, and
right.
That's how it becomes resistant to antibiotics.
Right.
Wow, that's really cool. So that's how it happens.
That's how it happens.
Why does the woman say this?
But first of all, though, how many pages do we have left? I told my roommate I'd meet her at the library at 7 o'clock.
Listen to part of a talk in a botany class.
Okay, so we've talked about some different types of root systems of plants, and I've shown you some pretty cool slides, but now I want to talk about the extent of the root system, the overall size of the root system, the depth. I want to tell you about one particular experiment. I think you're going to find this pretty amazing. Okay, so there was this scientist. This very meticulous scientist decided that the best place to see a whole root system, to actually see how big the entire system got, the best place would be to grow it where?
Water?
In water. So he took rye plants, it was rye plants, and he started growing them in water. Now, you've all heard of growing stuff in water before, right?
It's done commercially, right? Like to grow vegetables and flowers?
Right. They grow all kinds of commercial crops in water. So, if you're growing things in water, you can add the fertilizer. What do you need to do to that water besides put fertilizer in it? Anyone ever actually tried to grow plants in water? You must bubble water through it. Bubble gas through it. I'm sorry. You must bubble gas through it. So, gas, you have to bubble through. Think about the soil we talked about last week, about growing plants in soil. Think about some of you who have killed your favorite houseplants because you love them too much. If you overwater, why do your favorite houseplants die?
Oh, no oxygen.
Not enough oxygen for the roots, which do what 24 hours a day in all seasons?
Respiration?
Respire, respiration. They breathe. So if you just stick rye plants in water, it doesn't make a difference how much fertilizer you add. You also need to bubble gas through the water. So they have access to that oxygen. If they don't have that, they're in big trouble. Okay, so this scientist, grew a rye plant in water so he could see the root system, how big it got, its surface area. I read about this, and the book said 1,000 kilometers of roots. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. It just doesn't make any sense to me that could be right, but that's what all the books have, and no one's ever corrected it. So let me explain to you about this rye plant. If you take a little seed of many grasses, and remember, rye is a grass. If you take a tiny little seed and you germinate it, actually, take one of my least favorite grasses that starts growing about May. What's my least favorite grass that starts growing about May?
Crabgrass.
Crabgrass. Remember how I showed you in the lab, one little seed starts out producing one little shoot, then at a week or so later, you've got about 6 shoots. And then 3 weeks later, you've got about 15 shoots coming out all directions, like this. All those little shoots up there? Well, that's what they did with the rye. And the little seedlings started, and pretty soon there were several shoots, and then more shoots. In the end, that one single seed produced 80 shoots, with an average of 50 centimeters of height from one seed. 80 shoots coming out. Average 50 centimeters high. When they looked at the shoot versus the root surface, they found that the shoot surface, with all of its leaves, had a total surface area of about 5 square meters. Now, here's the biggie. When they looked at the root surface area, you would expect that the root and the shoot would be in balance, right? So they should be pretty close in terms of surface area, right? What's that? Did somebody say no? Well, you're absolutely correct. Instead of 5 square meters, the root system was found to have more than 200 square meters of surface area. Where did all of that extra surface area come from? Who did it? Who was responsible for all those extra square meters of surface area? What did roots do to increase their surface area?
Root hairs.
Root hairs, that's exactly it. So those root hairs were responsible for an incredible chunk of surface area. They constantly have to be spread out in the water so they can absorb minerals from the fertilizer. And of course, they need oxygen access as well.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
What do you need to do to that water besides put fertilizer in it? Anyone ever actually tried to grow plants in water? You must bubble water through it. Bubble gas through it. I'm sorry, you must bubble gas through it. So, gas, you have to bubble through.
Why did the professor say this?
I'm sorry, you must bubble gas through it.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I read about this, and the book said 1,000 kilometers of roots. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. It just doesn't make any sense to me that could be right, but that's what all the books have, and no one's ever corrected it. So let me explain to you about this rye plant.
What does the professor intend to explain? Listen to part of a lecture in a business management class.
Okay, let's talk about organization and structure in a company. How are companies typically structured?
Functionally.
And?
By projects.
Right, by function and by projects. 20 years ago, companies were organized in function groups, where people with a certain expertise worked together as a unit. The architects in one unit, the finance people in another unit. Well, nowadays, a lot of companies are organized around projects. Like a construction company could be building an office building in one city and an apartment house somewhere else, and each project has its own architects and engineers. Now, the good thing about project organization is that it's easier to change to adapt to the needs of the project. It's a small group, a dedicated team, not the whole company. Now, with that in mind, here's a question for you. Why do we continue to organize ourselves by function, even now, when in fact we admit that projects are the lifeblood of a lot of organizations? Why do some companies maintain a functional organization instead of organizing around projects? Yes?
Because if you don't have that functional structure within your organization, chances are you'd have a harder time meeting the goals of the projects.
Why?
Why?
Listen, let's say we got 4 new cars we want to design. Why do we need a functional organization? Why not just organize the company around the 4 projects? These people make car number 1, these other people make car number 2.
Yeah, but who's going to be responsible for what? You know, the way you tell who's...
Well, we'll appoint a manager. New car number 1 manager, car number 2 manager. They're completely responsible. Why should we have a single engineering department that has all 4 cars passing through it?
When you design a car, you need the expertise of all the engineers in the company. Each engineer needs to be in touch with the entire engineering department.
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why. Yes.
Well, to eliminate redundancy is probably one of the biggest factors in an organization, so that there's standards for uniformity and efficiency in the organization.
Okay, and that's probably the primary reason for functional organization right there, is that we want some engineering consistency. We want the same kind of technology used in all 4 cars. If we disperse those 4 engineers into 4 parts of the organization and they work by themselves, there's a lot less chance that the technology's going to be the same from car to car. So instead, we maintain the functional organization. That means the engineers work together in one part of the building, and their offices are next to each other because we want them to talk to each other. When an engineer works on a project, they bring the expertise of their whole functional group with them. But there's a downside of that, though, isn't there? I mean, organizing a company into functional groups is not all positive. Where's the allegiance of those engineers? It's to their coordinator, right? It's to that chief engineer. But we really want our one engineer, the engineer that's working on car number 1, we want that person's loyalty to be to that project as well as to the head of the engineering group. We really want both, don't we? We want to maintain the functional organization so we can maintain uniformity and technology transfer and expertise. We want the cutting-edge expertise in every group. But at the same time, we also want the engineer to be totally dedicated to the needs of the project. Ideally, we have a hybrid, a combination of both functional and project organization. But there's a problem with this kind of hybrid structure. When you have both functional and project organization, well, what does that violate in terms of basic management principles?
Unity of command.
Unity of command. That's exactly right. So this is a vicious violation of unity of command, isn't it? It says that this engineer working on a project seems to have two bosses. We got the engineering boss and we got the project manager boss. But the project manager is responsible for the project and is not the official manager of the engineer who works on the project. And we try to maintain peace in the organizations, and sometimes it's disrupted and we have conflicts, don't we? The project manager for car 1 wants a car part to fit in a particular way for a specific situation, a specialized case. Well, the engineering director says, no, we got to have standardization. We got to have all the cars done this way. We can't make a special mold for that particular part for that particular car. We're not going to do that. So we got a conflict.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Why should we have a single engineering department that has all 4 cars passing through it?
When you design a car, you need the expertise of all the engineers in the company. Each engineer needs to be in touch with the entire engineering department.
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why.
Why does the professor say this?
Yeah, but I keep asking, why? I want to know why.
In this question, you will be asked to talk about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare a response and 45 seconds to record the response. Some people who unexpectedly receive a large amount of money spend it on practical things, while others spend it for pleasure only. Which do you think is better and why? Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a conversation, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. A student has written a letter to the editor of City University's newspaper concerning the campus health center. You have 50 seconds to read the letter. Begin reading now. Now listen to 2 students discussing the letter.
Did you read that letter in the paper?
Sure. And though she's right about the problems, I don't think what she proposes will do much good.
Really?
Yeah. Take her first suggestion. I mean, have you seen the health center?
Of course. Why?
Well, it's tiny, right? The center suffers from lack of space, so unless they build more treatment rooms or offices or something...
Oh, I see.
And also, her second suggestion?
Seems like that'll help things out.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, think about it. A lot of students aren't even here on the weekends.
That's true.
They leave town and get away. There's not a lot of people here.
Yeah, like me. I go home probably at least twice a month.
Right. And a lot of us leave campus for the weekend even more often than that. So there's just not a lot of demand for treatment then. See what I mean?
The man expresses his opinion about the student's suggestions that are made in the letter. State the man's opinion and explain the reasons he gives for holding that opinion. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a talk, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Now read the passage about social loafing. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
Now, a study was done that illustrated this phenomenon. In the study, people were given an ordinary task that everyone has probably done before. They were simply asked to peel potatoes, and to peel as many potatoes as possible in a given amount of time. Okay, so some people worked alone, and they were told that the number of potatoes they each peeled would be recorded. Others peeled potatoes together as part of a group, and they were told that only the total number of potatoes peeled would be recorded, so it would be impossible to tell how many any one person had done. Then researchers compared the results of the people who worked alone and those that worked together to see if there was any difference. That is, they took the average score of the people working alone and compared it to the average score of the people working together in a group, and they did discover a difference. It turns out that people working as a group peeled significantly fewer potatoes than people who worked alone.
Using the example from the lecture, explain what social loafing is and how it affects people's behavior. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture and answer a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Now listen to part of a talk in a psychology class.
Okay, ever thought about the things that happen to you and what's responsible for them? We psychologists have a term, locus of control. Locus of control refers to where people think control over their lives comes from, whether it comes from themselves or from somewhere else. People who think that control is in themselves are internals, and people who think it comes from somewhere else are externals. Let's say there are two people going for job interviews. One of them is an internal. She has an internal locus of control. Since she thinks that control comes from within herself, she'll believe that her success and her preparation are really her responsibility. So she's likely to really work on her interview skills ahead of time. Then, if she gets the job, she'll believe that it's because she's worked so hard. And if she doesn't get it, well, she'll probably be disappointed with herself and try to figure out how she can improve for the next time. Okay, and another job candidate is an external. He perceives other things, say his interviewers, to have more influence. After all, it's their decision. It depends on what mood they're in and, luck. Now, with his external locus of control, he's not as hard on himself, so he's more likely to take risks. He might interview for a job that he's not completely qualified for, and if he gets it, he'll think he's really lucky, and because he believes external forces are in control, he might think it's because the interviewers were having a good day. And if he doesn't get it, he'll probably blame the interviewers, or bad luck, rather than look at himself and try to figure out what he could have done better.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain internal and external locus of control. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Often in science, new findings force us to re-examine earlier beliefs and assumptions. And a recent study of meerkats is having exactly this effect. The study examined the meerkat's behavior quite closely, much more closely than had ever been done before. And some interesting things were found, like about eating habits. It showed that typically meerkats eat before they stand guard. So the one standing guard had a full stomach. And the study also found that since the sentinel is the first to see a predator coming, it's the most likely to escape, because it often stands guard near a burrow, so it can run immediately into the burrow after giving the alarm. The other meerkats, the ones scattered about looking for food, are actually in greater danger. And in fact, other studies have suggested that when an animal creates an alarm, the alarm call might cause the other group members either to gather together or else to move about very quickly, behaviors that might actually draw the predator's attention away from the caller, increasing that animal's own chances of survival. And what about people? What about some human acts that might be considered altruistic? Let's take an extreme case. Suppose a person donates a kidney to a relative, or even to a complete stranger. A selfless act, right? But doesn't the donor receive appreciation and approval from the stranger and from society? Doesn't the donor gain an increased sense of self-worth? Couldn't such non-material rewards be considered very valuable to some people?
Summarize the points made in the lecture, being sure to explain how they oppose specific points made in the reading passage.
If a person receives a large amount of money, I believe it's better for him or her to use it for practical things rather than on pleasure only. Because there's been a lot of cases with people who win the lottery and they spend almost all the money for their own pleasure. And once they finish spending, then they don't have any more money to live the same kind of luxurious lifestyle. And at that point, a lot of people have lost their jobs or kind of got eaten over by all the money and all the greed that's involved. So I believe we should just spend it on practical things.
I think what spend it for pleasure only is better. My reason is that first, because now the life is so stressful. If you can buy something or do something to relax is so important. And second, pleasure is very important for every people. If someone is always happy, he or she will have a longer or happier life.
The man states that the solutions that the students suggest will not help to improve the situation because those solutions don't take into consideration some other issues of the health center. For example, when the man suggests to hire more doctors, he's not taking into consideration that there is a lack of space in the health center. So for them to hire more doctors, they also need more treatment rooms. He also mentions that the suggestion of to open weekends is not very viable because students aren't even on campus on weekends, so there is not a lot of demand of the service on those days. So he doesn't see the need to open the health center those days too. And so the man refutes the ideas exposed in the newspaper.
The man's opinion is he think that the student's opinion is not so good because he think the health center is very tiny and there are no spaces for more treatment room or office. And he thinks when at weekends students go downtown or other place, so almost nobody live in the campus. So he think the student's opinion on the newspaper is not so useful. And he have his opinion that he think the health center now is just okay because there's no way to change it.
And there are most many people to see a doctor on the weekend because they leave town and they leave the campus to go home to their recovery. So
social loafing is when people do not feel as motivated to put in their personal effort because they're working in a group. It means that people who work in a group do not feel responsible for the outcome of the group work, so they put in less effort than they would have if they were to do the same activity while they were on their own. For example, when people are asked to peel potatoes, they peel less number of potatoes while they're working in a group than they do when they have to peel the potatoes by themselves. And this is because they don't feel responsible they know that they're not going to be held responsible for the number of potatoes that are peeled in a group, while they are held directly responsible when they peel potatoes by themselves. So
social loafing is a decreasing the individual's efficiency in a work when they're working in a group. And then through the lecture, there was an example of peeling potatoes in a certain amount of time, and then some worked alone and some worked group, and then they're not sure how to count how many potatoes they did each when they worked in a group, and also they worked alone, and then so they got the average score from each, and then they discovered that the person who worked alone peeled more potatoes than who worked in a group. and that's the social loafing. They just decrease their individual efficiency when they're working in a group.
In the example, the interviewee with the internal locus of control, the interviewee would think that it's her responsibility, his or her responsibility, to get the job. Therefore, she thinks that her readiness, her qualifications, and everything needed to get the job is within her reach or within her control. She can do things in order to improve herself and ensure that she can get the job. Whereas the external locus of control believes that the factors that influence the decision of getting the job comes from his luck, from the environment, and like the mood of the interviewer.
The internal locus of control means one believes that she can control her life and she will respond for her life, for her behaviors. And the external control means the opposite. For example, the job, two persons to make a job interview, the internal locus of control person will work very hard and thinks the result of the interview will give her confidence. If she gets the job, she will feel confidence, and if she lost it, she will disappear, and she will improve herself next time. While the external person will do the interview just for risk, and he believe in luck, and he won't look at himself to improve himself.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Sandy, how's class been going for you this semester?
Oh, it's great. I really like your business psychology class, but I have one major concern about the last assignment. You know, the one where we have to interview a local business owner, entrepreneur.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask. The thing is, I'm new to the area, and I don't know people off campus. So I was wondering could you possibly give me the name of someone I could interview?
You don't know anyone who owns a business?
Well, yeah, back home. My next-door neighbors. They own a shoe store, and they're really successful, but they're not local.
Well, it wouldn't be fair to the other students if I gave you the name of a contact, but I could help you figure out a way to find someone on your own. Let's see. Do you read the local newspaper?
Sure, whenever I have the time.
Well, the business section in the paper often has stories about local business people who've been successful. If you find an article, you could call the person who's profiled.
You mean just call them up out of the blue and ask them if they'll talk to me?
Sure, why not?
Well, aren't people like that awfully busy? Too busy to talk to a random college student?
Many people enjoy telling the story of how they got started. Remember, this is a business psychology class, and for this assignment, I want you to get some real insight about business owners, their personality, what drives them to become an entrepreneur.
Like how they think.
And what motivates them. Why did they start their business? I'm sure they'd talk to you, especially if you tell them you might start a business someday.
I'm not sure I'd have the guts to do that. Opening a business seems so risky, so scary.
Well, you can ask them if they felt that way, too. Now you just need to find someone to interview to see if your instincts are correct.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Are you having trouble coming up with interview questions?
Well, that's just it. I worked on my high school newspaper for years, so I actually have great questions to ask.
What does the student imply? Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
Okay, I want to begin today by talking about calendars. I know some of you are thinking it's not all that fascinating, right? But listen, the next time you look at a calendar, I want you to keep something in mind. There are at least 3 natural ways of measuring the passage of time: by day, by month, and by year. And these are all pretty easy to see, right? I mean, a day is based on one rotation of Earth. A month is how long the moon takes to move around the Earth. And a year is the time it takes for Earth to move around the sun, right? So they're all based on natural events. But the natural clocks of Earth, the moon, and the sun run on different times. And you can't divide any one of these time periods by another one without having some messy fraction left over. I mean, one lunar month, that's the time it takes for the moon to go around Earth. 1 month is about 29 and a half days. Not really a nice round number. And 1 year is a little more than 365 days. So these are obviously numbers that don't divide into each other very neatly. And this makes it pretty difficult to create some sort of tidy calendar that really works. Not that different cultures haven't tried. Have any of you ever been to Stonehenge? No? You know that amazing circle of giant stones in England? Well, if you ever go and find yourself wondering why this culture, way back in prehistoric England, would go to so much work to construct this monumental ring of enormous stones, well, keep in mind that a lot of us think it was designed, at least partially, as a calendar, to mark when the seasons of the year begin, according to the exact day when the sun comes up from a particular direction. I have colleagues who insist it's a temple, maybe, or a tomb, but they can't deny that it was also used as a calendar, probably to help figure out, for example, when farmers should begin their planting each year. The Mayans in Central America also invented a calendar, but for a different purpose. The Mayans, especially the royalty and priests, wanted to look at long cycles of history. So the calendar they used had to be able to count far into the future as well as far into the past. And not only were the Mayans keeping track of the natural timekeepers we mentioned before, Earth, the moon, and the sun, but another natural timekeeper, the planet Venus. Venus rises in the sky as the morning star every 584 days. And the Venus cycle was incorporated in the Mayan calendar. So the Mayans kept track of long periods of time, and they did it so accurately, in fact, that their calendar is considered about as complicated and sophisticated as any in the world. Now, the ancient Chinese believed very strongly in astrology, the idea that you can predict future events based on the positions of the stars and planets, like, say, Jupiter. Incidentally, the whole Chinese system of astrology was based on the fact that the planet Jupiter goes around the sun once every 12 years. So one orbit of Jupiter lasts 12 of our Earth years. Apparently, that's why the Chinese calendar has a cycle of 12 years. You know, like the year of the dragon, the year of the tiger, and so on. All parts of a 12-year astrological cycle that we get from the orbit of Jupiter. Calendars based on the orbits of other planets, though, are a lot less common than those based on the cycle of the moon, the lunar month. I could mention any number of important cultures around the world that have depended on lunar calendars, but there really isn't time. So let's go right to the calendar that's now used throughout most of the world, a solar calendar, based on the number of days in a year. This calendar is mainly derived from the one the ancient Romans devised a couple thousand years ago. I mean, the Romans, with more than a little help from the Greeks, realized that a year actually lasts about 365 1/4 days. And so they decided to round off most years to 365 days, but make every 4th year into a leap year. I mean, somehow you have to account for that extra 1/4 of a day each year. So every 4 years, they made the calendar 1 day longer. By adding the leap year, the Romans were able to make a calendar that worked so well that with a few minor adjustments, this calendar is still widely used today.
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a university employee.
Oh, hello. Can I help you?
Yeah. I'm looking for Professor Kirk. Is she here? Is this her office?
Yes, you're in the right place. Professor Kirk's office is right behind me. But no, she's not here right now.
Do you know when she'll be back?
Well, she's teaching all morning. She won't be back until... Let me check. She won't be back until after lunch. That's when she has her office hours. Perhaps you could come back then?
Oh, unfortunately, no. I have class this afternoon, and I was really hoping to talk to her today. Hey, do you know if she's accepting any more students into her Introduction to Biology class?
You want to know if you can take the class?
Yes, if she's letting any more students sign up, I'd like to join the class.
Introduction to Biology is a very popular class, especially when she teaches it. A lot of students take it.
Yeah, that's why the registrar said it was full. I've got the form the registrar gave me to get her permission to take the class. It's all filled out except for her signature. I'm hoping she'll let me in even though the class is full. You see, I'm a senior this year, and this will be my last semester, so it's my last chance.
Oh, wow, really? Most students fulfill their science requirement the first year.
Well, to be honest, I kept putting it off. I'm not really a big fan of science classes in general, and with the labs and everything, I've never quite found the time.
Your advisor didn't say anything?
Well, to tell you the truth, she's been after me to take a class like this for a while, but I'm double majoring in art and journalism, and so my schedule's been really tight with all the classes I gotta take, so somehow I never...
Well, perhaps you could leave the form with me, and I'll see if she'll sign it for you.
I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person. I didn't want to do it, but I guess I'll have to send her an email.
Not all professors check their emails regularly. I'm not sure if Professor Kirk does it or not. Here's an idea. Why don't you stick a note explaining your situation under her door and ask her to call you if she needs more information?
Hey, that's a good idea. And then I can leave the form with you, if you still don't mind.
Why does the man say this to the woman?
I appreciate that, but maybe I should explain the problem to her in person.
Listen to part of a lecture in an astronomy class.
I'm sure you all have been following the news about Mars. A lot of spacecraft have been visiting the planet recently. Some have gone into orbit around it, while others have landed on it. And they've sent back an abundance of data that's reshaping our knowledge, our vision of the planet in a lot of ways. Is there anything that you've been particularly struck by in all the news reports?
Well, they seem to mention water a lot, which kind of surprised me, as I have this picture in my head that Mars is dry, sort of dry and dead.
You're not the only one. For centuries, most of our knowledge of the planet came from what we saw through telescopes. So, obviously, it was pretty limited. And our views of the planet were formed as much by writers as they were by serious scientists. When the first science fiction stories came out, Mars was described as being a lot like Earth, except...
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? Really,
Well, it seems silly to us now, but those ideas were quite imaginative and occasionally scary in their time. Anyway, we began to rethink our image of Mars when the first spacecraft flew by the planet in 1965 and sent pictures back to Earth. Those pictures showed a planet that looked a lot more like our moon than Earth. Lots of craters and not much else. It was bitterly cold, it had a very thin atmosphere, and that atmosphere was mostly carbon dioxide. So the view of Mars after this first flyby mission was that dry, dead planet that Lisa mentioned. But then there were more visits to the planet in the 1970s. And this time, the spacecraft didn't just fly by, they orbited, or landed. This allowed us to receive much more detailed images of the planet, and it turned out to be a pretty interesting place. Mars has a lot more than craters. It has giant volcanoes and deep canyons. It also showed signs of dried-up riverbeds and plains that had been formed by massive floods. So we concluded that there must have been water on the planet at one time, billions of years ago. Now, what does it take for water to exist?
You need to have a warm enough temperature so that it doesn't freeze.
That's one thing. And the other is that you need enough atmospheric pressure, thick enough air so that the water doesn't instantly vaporize. The Mars we see today doesn't have either of those conditions. It's too cold, and the air is too thin. But a long time ago, there may have been a thicker atmosphere that created a greenhouse effect that raised temperatures. And maybe that combination produced water on the surface of the planet. So maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration. Now, let's jump forward a few decades to the beginning of this century and a new generation of orbiters and landers that have been sent to Mars. Of course, the scientific instruments now surveying Mars are far more sophisticated than the instruments of the 70s, so we're getting all kinds of new data for analysis. And not surprisingly, that data is challenging our notions of what Mars is like. Lisa, you mentioned that a lot of the news reports talked about water. Do you remember any of the details?
Well, they were showing these pictures of these long cuts in the ground, which would be gullies here, on Earth. They say that since gullies are usually formed by water, it seems like they may be evidence that water still exists on Mars, but I didn't get how that worked.
I'm not surprised. There are a lot of theories, a lot of speculation, and some argue the formations aren't caused by water at all. But there's some ingenious theories that assume that there's a lot of water right under the planet's surface that somehow is causing the gullies to form. If we could only get a lander there. But the gullies aren't in places where we can send landers yet. Anyway, if there is some kind of water activity, it may change our view of the planet once again to something that's not dead, not even a fossil, but rather a planet like Earth that undergoes cycles. Think of our ice ages over long periods of time. Maybe Mars could sustain water again at some distant date.
Why does the professor say this?
So, maybe Mars wasn't just a dead, boring rock. Maybe it was a fascinating fossil that was once alive and dynamic, worthy of exploration.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I know the planet was red and the people were green. I've seen some of those old movies. What were they thinking? Really.
Why does the student say this?
What were they thinking?
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class. The professor has been talking about colossal statues.
We've been looking at colossal statues, works of exceptionally huge size, and their essentially public role in commemorating a political or religious figure. We've seen how some of these statues date back thousands of years, like the statues of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, which you can still visit today, and how others, though surviving only in legend, have fired the imagination of writers and artists right up to our own time, such as the Colossus of Rhodes, that 110-foot statue of the Greek god Helios. Remember, this same word, colossus, which means a giant or larger-than-life-size statue, is what today's term colossal derives from. Now, it was one thing to build such statues at an equally colossal cost when the funds were being allocated by ancient kings and pharaohs. But if we're going to think about modern-day colossal statues, we need to re-examine more closely their role as social and political symbols in order to understand why a society today, a society of free, tax-paying citizens, would agree to allocate so much of its resources to erecting them. A good example to start out with would be Mount Rushmore. Now, many of you have probably seen pictures of Mount Rushmore. Perhaps you've actually visited the place. Mount Rushmore in South Dakota is a colossal representation of the faces of 4 U.S. presidents: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, carved directly into a mountain. Imagine, each of those faces in the rock is over 60 feet high. Now, carving their faces took over 6.5 years and cost almost $1 million. And this was in the 1930s, during the worst economic depression in U.S. history. Does that strike any of you as odd? Well, I personally think that the Great Depression of the 1930s actually makes this more understandable, not less so. Often it's the case that precisely at times of hardship, when the very fabric of society seems to be unraveling and confidence is eroding, that people clamor for some public expression of strength and optimism, perhaps as a way of symbolizing its endurance in the face of difficulty. So, with that in mind, let's go back to Mount Rushmore. Actually, the original motivation for a colossal monument in South Dakota had very little to do with all this symbolism, and everything to do with money. You see, it was first conceived of basically as a tourist attraction, and it was supposed to feature the images of legendary figures of the American West, like the explorers Lewis and Clark. The government of South Dakota thought it would bring lots of money into the state. It was only later on that the sculptor, the artist who designed and oversaw the project, a man named Gutzon Borglum, decided the project should be a monument honoring 4 of the most respected presidents in U.S. history, much more than a tourist attraction. Its very prominence and permanence became perceived as a symbol of the endurance of U.S. ideals and the greatness of the country's early leaders. So, you see, what began as a tourist attraction became something far loftier. Let's look at another example of this phenomenon. The Statue of Liberty is another colossal statue, one that I assume a number of you are familiar with. But I would guess that, like many people today, you don't realize that when it was designed over a century ago by a French sculptor, it was intended to symbolize the long friendship between the people of France and the people of the United States, one which dated back to France's support of the American colonies' war for independence from the British. But the shift in the statue's meaning started soon after it was built. Back in 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote that famous poem, the one that goes, "Give me your tired, your poor," and so on and so forth. That poem describes the Statue of Liberty as a beacon of welcome for the entire world. Well, in the early 1900s, it was put on a plaque on the pedestal that the Statue of Liberty stands on. From that point on, the Statue of Liberty was no longer perceived as just a gift between friendly republics. It now became a tribute to the United States' history of immigration and openness. This association was strengthened in the imagination of the general public just a few decades after the statue's completion with the immigration waves of the early 20th century, especially since the statue happened to be the first sign of America seen by those immigrants sailing into the port of New York. So, as with Mount Rushmore, the original motivation for this colossal statue was forgotten, and the statue is now valued for more important reasons.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Back in 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote that famous poem, you know, the one that goes, "Give me you're tired, you're poor," and so on and so forth.
What does the professor imply about the poem by Emma Lazarus? In this question, you will be asked to talk about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare a response and 45 seconds to record the response. Some students would prefer to live with roommates. Others would prefer to live alone. Which option would you prefer, and why?
Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a conversation, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Read the article from the university newspaper about the plan to build new student housing. You will have 50 seconds to read the article. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students discussing the article.
I can't believe these plans. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Really? Seemed okay to me, especially the argument about the cars.
Yeah, I know, but the thing is, it doesn't matter where students live, because they still have to get to class somehow, right? At least if they built new dorms on campus, students would use campus transportation
instead of their cars. I see what you're getting at. If they live off campus, they're still going to have to drive and park on campus. Might even create more traffic.
Exactly.
Okay. Still, though, the point about students interacting more with people in the community, that doesn't seem to be a bad thing, does it?
But the more time spent off campus, in town, the less time spent on campus. What about all the clubs, shows, discussions, all the campus happenings that just kind of happen? It's important to be on campus to really take advantage of these things. Having a different living experience shouldn't be given up at the expense of not being as much a part of the university community.
The woman expresses her opinion of the university's plan. State her opinion and explain the reason she gives for holding that opinion.
Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a talk, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Now read the passage about a topic in psychology. You will have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
So, we encounter this in life all the time, but many of us are unaware that we do this, even psychologists who study it, like me. For example, the other day I was at the store, and I was getting in line to buy something. But just before I was actually in line, some guy comes out of nowhere and cuts right in front of me. Well, I was really annoyed and thought, that was rude. I assumed he was just a selfish, inconsiderate person, when in fact I had no idea why he cut in line in front of me, or whether he even realized he was doing it. Maybe he didn't think I was actually in line yet. But my immediate reaction was to assume he was a selfish or rude person. Okay, so a few days after that, I was at the store again, only this time I was in a real hurry. I was late for an important meeting, and I was frustrated that everything was taking so long. And what's worse, all the checkout lines were long, and it seemed like everyone was moving so slowly. But then I saw a slightly shorter line. But some woman with a lot of stuff to buy was walking toward it, so I basically ran to get there first before her. And, well, I did. Now, I didn't think of myself as a bad or rude person for doing this. I had an important meeting to get to. I was in a hurry, so, I had done nothing wrong.
Explain how the two examples discussed by the professor illustrate differences in the ways people explain behavior.
Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture and answer a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Now listen to part of a lecture in a child development class.
Okay, young children and art. Research suggests that learning art skills can benefit a young child's development. Two of the ways it can do this is by providing a platform to express complex emotions and by encouraging persistence. Now, what do I mean when I say a platform to express complex emotions? Young children have limited vocabulary. So how would they communicate the feeling of pride, for example? A drawing, though, making a drawing of feeling proud, this is something a young child could do. So a little girl might draw herself jumping up in the air next to her bike. In the drawing, her arms are raised up in the air and she's smiling. Children can communicate their emotions, whether positive or negative, through the drawing better than they could with words. And encouraging persistence? Well, art skills can help children to develop patience and concentration to persist in an activity, the willingness to keep trying to reach a goal. So, suppose there's a little boy who wants to mold a lump of clay into the shape of a car. The first attempt doesn't look too much like a car. He's disappointed, but wants to try again. The second, third, fourth try still don't look quite right, but there's improvement with every attempt. So after some time, he gets to the point where he's satisfied with his creation. The newly shaped clay car is an instant reminder of an accomplishment, a success resulting from his persistence. The boy may be able to transfer this lesson toward other situations and activities because, well, he's had the experience of successfully accomplishing a goal through hard work.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain how learning art can impact a child's development.
Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Lately, we've been seeing some professors on television. Though it's sometimes claimed to be a good thing, we should question whether anybody really benefits from it. First of all, it's not good for the professors themselves, not from a professional standpoint. Rightly or wrongly, a professor who appears on TV tends to get the reputation among fellow professors of being someone who is not a serious scholar, someone who chooses to entertain rather than to educate. And for that reason, TV professors may not be invited to important conferences, important meetings to discuss their academic work. They may even have difficulty getting money to do research. So for professors, being a TV celebrity has important disadvantages. A second point is that being on TV can take a lot of a professor's time. Not just the time on TV, but also time figuring out what to present, and time spent rehearsing, travel time, even time getting made up to look good for the cameras. And all this time comes out of the time the professor can spend doing research, meeting with students, and attending to university business. So you can certainly see there are problems for the university and its students when professors are in the TV studio and not on campus. So, who does benefit? The public? That's not so clear either. Look, professors do have a lot of knowledge to offer, but TV networks don't want really serious, in-depth academic lectures for after-dinner viewing. What the networks want is the academic title, not the intellectual substance. The material that professors usually present on TV, such as background on current events or some brief historical introduction to a new movie version of a great literary work, this material is not much different from what viewers would get from a TV reporter who had done a little homework.
Summarize the points made in the lecture, being sure to explain how they oppose specific points made in the reading passage.
On the one hand, I think to live with a roommate could be a good thing since you always have somebody to talk with when you have problems or things like that, and it's a good way to meet people. But on the other hand, you can't really do whatever you want. I mean, if you like parties and if your roommate does not, it's not a good thing for you. You are not free to do what you like, and it's not really interesting, and it's well, I live by myself and I'm very glad since I can do what I want. I have nobody to tell me what to do, and
some students will prefer to live with a romance. However, I prefer live in the Illuminism because it is a period there is
the man say that
in the woman's opinion, the plans of the university to build housing, to build new student dorms outside off campus are not good. She is against that because she thinks that the reason the university is giving, which is that there are too many cars on campus already, and there is no space for more dorms and more cars there, doesn't really work, because she says that if people live on campus, they don't even need a car to go to university, but if they live off campus, they will need a car to get there. That's her one reason, and she also says it's better for students if they live on campus, because that way they have better possibilities to enjoy all
the benefits from their student life. They can take part in many of the students' actions on campus without having to worry how to get there and how to get away from there again.
She doesn't agree with the plan because she personally thinks that if the location of the students is on the campus, they will not need cars, so they will not need parking because they will use the campus transportation. But of course, if they are out, they will need cars, and it will be bad for the campus. And she thinks that if people are on the campus, they can assist to campus happening, and it's very important because with that they can be part of university community, which is more important than being out of the campus and meeting other people.
To begin my statement, I have to say that there are two main different kinds how you evaluate other people or your own. If you evaluate other people, you look just first on the personality or something to connect with the character. If you look at yourself, you see more the surrounding or the situations than you are, and don't see the fools or problems for yourself or what you do by yourself. And the professor has two examples to illustrate this differences, how people explain behavior. First, he was in line and a person jumped before him. He did line jumping, and he was very annoyed about this fact because he thought this person is rude or selfish. But just a couple of days later, he was in a hurry and had an important meeting, only a meeting, and then he did the same, and he just explained his behavior due to the fact that he had no time at an important meeting, and so he thought it was nothing wrong.
The two examples discussed by the professor illustrate difference in the ways people explain behavior, because the first one, he doesn't understand why somebody took his place in the store. He thought that people was selfish, but in fact he didn't realize why the people took his place. And the second example, he was in a hurry, and he took the place of somebody else, and this is explained by the fact that when people explain somebody's behavior, they base on the character and not on the situation of the other people. The two examples discussed by the professor illustrate difference in the ways people explain behavior, because the first one, he doesn't understand why somebody took his place in the store. He thought that people was selfish, but in fact he didn't realize why the people took his place. And the second example, he was in a hurry, and he took the place of somebody else, and this is explained by the fact that when people explain somebody's behavior, they base on the character and not on the situation of the other people.
There are two ways in which art can foster a child's development. One way is if there's a platform offered for expressing a child's complex emotions, and the other one is encouraging a child's persistence. A child has very limited vocabulary, and that's why it cannot verbally express some complex emotions like grief and all this. So in a drawing, a child has the opportunity to actually show what it feels. And also with persistence, it's meant that a child can keep trying to create something, and when it's finally done, there's this success factor, an accomplishment.
Learning art could be important for children since it can be seen as a platform to express complex emotion, for example, like pride, since she gave an example of a little boy who wanted to draw a car. His first attempt was bad, but the other one, the third, the fourth, the fifth were good, so he was satisfied with himself, and he achieved thanks to its persistence. So art has been good for him, and learning art is also a good way to learn art skills, so it can only be an asset for a child.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a receptionist at the registrar's office on the first day of the semester.
Excuse me, I'm supposed to be having my physics class in the science building, but no one's in the classroom. Could you tell me where the class is? Physics 403? Has it been moved?
Well, there's a room assignment sheet on the bulletin board outside this office.
Yeah, I know, but my class isn't listed there. There must be some kind of mistake or something. Could you look it up, please?
Okay. Let me check on the computer. It's physics, right? Wait, did you say physics 403?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, but it says here that it was canceled. You should have gotten a letter from the registrar's office about this.
What? I never got it.
Are you sure? Because it says on the computer that the letter was sent out to students a week ago.
Really? I should have gotten it by now. I wonder if I threw it away with all the junk mail by mistake.
Well, it does happen. Let me check something. What's your name?
Woodhouse. Laura Woodhouse.
Okay. Woodhouse. Let me see. It says here we sent it to your apartment on Center Street.
Oh, that's my old apartment. I moved out of there a little while ago.
Well, and I suppose you haven't changed your mailing address at the administration office? Well, that would explain it.
Yeah, I guess that's it. But how can they cancel a class after offering it? If I'd known this was going to happen, I'd have taken it last semester.
I know. It's really inconvenient for you. I understand that. But if we don't have enough students signed up for the course, the college can't offer it. You know, it's a practical issue, like we can't have an instructor when there are only a few students in the class. You see what I mean?
I guess, but now I don't know what course I should take instead.
Okay, let's see. Do you have any courses you were going to take next semester? If you do, you might want to take them now and sign up for Physics 403 next semester.
Yeah, I guess I could do that. I just hope it won't be canceled again. Do you know how many people have to be enrolled in order to keep a class from being canceled?
Well, it depends on the class, but for that class you have to have, let's see, usually it'd be at least 10 people. But since it was canceled this semester, they might even do it with less. But you know what you should do? Give the physics department a call a couple of weeks before the semester starts. They'll be able to tell you if they're planning to go through with it. It's their decision, actually.
Oh, okay, I'll do that. Thanks for the info.
No problem. Sorry about the class. Oh, why don't you go change your mailing address now? It'll only take a minute.
Oh, sure, I'll do that right away.
Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
Excuse me, I'm supposed to be having my physics class in the science building, but no one's in the classroom. Could you tell me where the class is? Physics 403? Has it been moved?
Well, there's a room assignment sheet on the bulletin board outside this office.
What does the man imply when he says this?
Well, there's a room assignment sheet on the bulletin board outside this office.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class.
Now, we've been talking about the loss of animal habitat from housing developments, growing cities, small habitat losses. But today I want to begin talking about what happens when habitat is reduced across a large area. There are, of course, animal species that require large areas of habitat, and some migrate over very long distances. So what's the impact of habitat loss on those animals that need large areas of habitat? Well, I'll use the hummingbirds as an example. Now, you know a hummingbird is amazingly small, but even though it's really tiny, it migrates over very long distances, travels up and down the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, back and forth between where it breeds in the summer and the warmer climates where it spends the winter. So we would say that this whole area over which it migrates is its habitat, because on this long-distance journey, it needs to come down to feed and sleep every so often, right? Well, the hummingbird beats its wings, get this, about 3,000 times per minute. So you think, wow, it must need a lot of energy, a lot of food, right? Well, it does. It drinks a lot of nectar from flowers and feeds on some insects, but it's energy efficient, too. You can't say it isn't. I mean, as it flies all the way across the Gulf of Mexico, it uses up almost none of its body fat. But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to eat. So hummingbirds have to rely on plants in their natural habitat. And it goes without saying, but, well, the opposite's true as well. Plants depend on hummingbirds, too. There are some flowers that can only be pollinated by the hummingbird. Without it stopping to feed and spreading pollen from flower to flower, these plants would cease to exist. But the problem, well, as natural habitat along these migration routes is developed by humans for housing or agriculture or cleared for raising cattle, for instance, there's less food available for migrating hummingbirds. Their nesting sites are affected too, by the same sorts of human activities. And all of these activities pose a real threat to the hummingbird population. So to help them survive, we need to preserve their habitats. And one of the concrete ways people have been doing this is by cleaning up polluted habitat areas and then replanting flowers, replanting native flowers that hummingbirds feed on. Promoting ecological tourism is another way to help save their habitat, as the number of visitors, ecotourists, who come to hummingbird habitats to watch the birds, the more the number of visitors grows, the more local businesses profit. So ecological tourism can bring financial rewards. All the more reason to value these beautiful little creatures in their habitat, right? But to understand more about how to protect and support hummingbirds the best we can, we've got to learn more about their breeding, nesting sites, and migration routes, and also about the natural habitats we find there. That should help us determine how to prevent further decline in the population. A good research method, a good way to learn more, is by running a banding study. Banding the birds allows us to track them over their lifetime. It's a practice that's been used by researchers for years. In fact, most of what we know about hummingbirds comes from banding studies, where we capture a hummingbird and make sure all the information about it, like its weight and its age and length, are all recorded and put into an international information database. And then we place an extremely lightweight band around one of its legs. Well, what looks like a leg, although technically it's considered part of the bird's foot. Anyway, these bands are perfectly safe, and some hummingbirds have worn them for years with no evidence of any problems. The band is labeled with a tracking number. Oh, and there's a phone number on the band for people to call, for free, to report a banded bird they've found or recaptured. So when a banded bird is recaptured and reported, we learn about its migration route, its growth, and how long it's been alive, its lifespan. One recaptured bird had been banded almost 12 years earlier. She's one of the oldest hummingbirds on record. Another interesting thing we've learned is that some hummingbirds, they no longer use a certain route. They travel by a different route to reach their destination. And findings like these have been of interest to biologists and environmental scientists in a number of countries who are trying to understand the complexities of how changes in a habitat affect the species in it, species like the hummingbirds.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
So, hummingbirds have to rely on plants in their natural habitat. And it goes without saying, but, well, the opposite's true as well. Plants depend on hummingbirds, too.
What does the professor imply when she says this?
And it goes without saying.
Listen to part of a lecture in a film history class.
Okay, we've been discussing film in the 1920s and 30s, and how back then film categories, as we know them today, had not yet been established. We said that, by today's standards, many of the films of the 20s and 30s would be considered hybrids. That is, a mixture of styles that wouldn't exactly fit into any of today's categories. And in that context, today we're going to talk about a filmmaker who began making very unique films in the late 1920s. He was French, and his name was Jean Painlevé. Jean Painlevé was born in 1902. He made his first film in 1928. Now, in a way, Painlevé's films conform to norms of the 20s and 30s. That is, they don't fit very neatly into the categories we use to classify films today. That said, even by the standards of the 20s and 30s, Painlevé's films were a unique hybrid of styles. He had a special way of fusing, or some people might say confusing, science and fiction. His films begin with facts, but then they become more and more fictional. They gradually add more and more fictional elements. In fact, Painlevé was known for saying that science is fiction. Painlevé was a pioneer in underwater filmmaking, and a lot of his short films focus on the aquatic animal world. He liked to show small underwater creatures displaying what seemed like familiar human characteristics, what we think of as unique to humans. He might take a clip of a mollusk going up and down in the water and set it to music, to make it look as if the mollusk were dancing to the music, like a human being, that sort of thing. But then he'd suddenly change the image or narration to remind us how different the animals are, how unlike humans. He confused his audience in the way he portrayed the animals he filmed, mixing up our notions of the categories human and animal. The films make us a little uncomfortable at times because we're uncertain about what we're seeing. It gives his films an uncanny feature. The familiar made unfamiliar. The normal made suspicious. He liked twists. He liked the unusual. In fact, one of his favorite sea animals was the seahorse, because with seahorses, it's the male that gets pregnant. It's the male that carries the babies. And he thought that was great. His first and most celebrated underwater film is about the seahorse. Susan, you have a question?
But underwater filmmaking wasn't that unusual, was it? I mean, weren't there other people making movies underwater?
Well, actually, it was pretty rare at that time. I mean, we're talking the early 1930s here.
But what about Jacques Cousteau? Wasn't he like an innovator, with underwater photography too?
Ah, Jacques Cousteau. Well, Painlevé and Cousteau did both film underwater, and they were both innovators, so you're right in that sense. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. First of all, Painlevé was about 20 years ahead of Cousteau, and Cousteau's adventures were high-tech with lots of fancy equipment, whereas Painlevé kind of patched equipment together as he needed it. Cousteau usually filmed large animals, usually in the open sea, whereas Painlevé generally filmed smaller animals, and he liked to film in shallow water. What else? Well, the main difference was that Cousteau simply investigated and presented the facts. He didn't mix in fiction. He was a strict documentarist. He set the standard, really, for the nature documentary. Painlevé, on the other hand, as we said before, mixed in elements of fiction, and his films are much more artistic, incorporating music as an important element. John, you have a question?
Well, maybe I shouldn't be asking this, but if Painlevé's films are so special, so good, why haven't we ever heard of them? I mean, everyone's heard of Jacques Cousteau.
Well, that's a fair question. The short answer is that Painlevé's style just never caught on with the general public. I mean, it probably goes back, at least in part, to what we mentioned earlier, that the people didn't know what to make of his films, that they were confused by them. Whereas Cousteau's documentaries were very straightforward, met people's expectations more than Painlevé's films did. But your true film history buffs know about him, and Painlevé's still highly respected in many circles.
What does the student imply when he says this?
Well, maybe I shouldn't be asking this, but if Painlevé's films are so special, so good, why haven't we ever heard of them? I mean, everyone's heard of Jacques Cousteau.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Professor Archer. You know how in class last week you said that you were looking for students who were interested in volunteering for your archaeology project?
Of course. Are you volunteering?
Yes, I am. It sounds really interesting. But, do I need to have any experience with these kinds of projects?
No, not really. I assume that most students taking the introductory level class will have little or no experience with archaeological research, but that's okay.
Oh, good. That's a relief. Actually, that's why I'm volunteering for the project, to get experience. What kind of work is it?
Well, as you know, we're studying the history of the campus this semester. This used to be an agricultural area, and we already know that where the main lecture hall now stands, there once were a farmhouse and barn that were erected in the late 1700s. We're excavating near the lecture hall to see what types of artifacts we find. You know, things people used in the past that got buried when the campus was constructed. We've already begun to find some very interesting items, like old bottles, buttons, pieces of clay pottery.
Buttons and clay pottery? Did the old owners leave in such a hurry that they left their clothes and dishes behind?
That's just one of the questions we hope to answer with this project.
Wow. And it's all right here on campus.
That's right. No traveling involved. I wouldn't expect volunteers to travel to a site, especially in the middle of the semester. We expect to find many more things, but we do need more people to help.
So, how many student volunteers are you looking for?
I'm hoping to get 5 or 6. I've asked for volunteers in all the classes I teach, but no one's responded. You're the first person to express interest.
Well, it sounds like it could be a lot of work. Is there any way I can use the experience to get some extra credit in class? I mean, can I write a paper about it?
I think it'll depend on what type of work you do in the excavation, but I imagine we can arrange something. Well, actually, I've been considering offering extra credit for class because I've been having a tough time getting volunteers. Extra credit is always a good incentive for students.
And how often would you want the volunteers to work?
We're asking for 3 or 4 hours per week, depending on your schedule. A senior researcher, I think you know John Franklin, my assistant, is on site every day.
Sure, I know John. By the way, will there be some sort of training?
Yes, I want to wait till Friday to see how many students volunteer. And then I'll schedule a training class next week at a time that's convenient for everyone.
Okay, I'll wait to hear from you. Thanks a lot for accepting me.
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class. The professor has been discussing the origins of art.
Some of the world's oldest preserved art is the cave art of Europe, most of it in Spain and France. And the earliest cave paintings found to date are those of the Chauvet Cave in France, discovered in 1994. And, I remember when I heard about the results of the dating of the Chauvet paintings, I said to my wife, "Can you believe these paintings are over 30,000 years old?" And my 3-year-old daughter piped up and said, "Is that older than my great-grandmother?" But that was the oldest age she knew. And come to think of it, it's pretty hard for me to really understand how long 30,000 years is, too. I mean, we tend to think the people who lived at that time must have been pretty primitive. But I'm going to show you some slides in a few minutes, and I think you'll agree with me that this art is anything but primitive. They're masterpieces, and they look so real, so alive, that it's very hard to imagine that they're so very old. Now, not everyone agrees on exactly how old. A number of the Chauvet paintings have been dated by a lab to 30,000 or more years ago. That would make them not just older than any other cave art, but about twice as old as the art in the caves at Altamira or Lascaux, which you may have heard of. Some people find it hard to believe Chauvet is so much older than Altamira and Lascaux, and they noted that only one lab did the dating for Chauvet, without independent confirmation from any other lab. But be that as it may, whatever the exact date, whether it's 15,000, 20,000, or 30,000 years ago, the Chauvet paintings are from the dawn of art. So they're a good place to start our discussion of cave painting. Now, one thing you've got to remember is the context of these paintings. Paleolithic humans, that's the period we're talking about here, the Paleolithic, the early Stone Age, not too long after humans first arrived in Europe. The climate was significantly colder then, and so rock shelters, shallow caves, were valued as homes protected from the wind and rain. And in some cases, at least, artists drew on the walls of their homes. But many of the truly great cave art sites, like Chauvet, were never inhabited. These paintings were made deep inside a dark cave where no natural light can penetrate. There's no evidence of people ever living here. Cave bears, yes, but not humans. You would have had to make a special trip into the cave to make the paintings, and a special trip to go see it. And each time you'd have to bring along torches to light your way. And people did go see the art. There's charcoal marks from their torches on the cave walls, clearly dating from thousands of years after the paintings were made. So we can tell people went there. They came, but they didn't stay. Deep inside a cave like that is not really a place you'd want to stay. So why? What inspired the Paleolithic artists to make such beautiful art in such inaccessible places? We'll never really know, of course, though it's interesting to speculate. But getting to the paintings themselves, virtually all Paleolithic cave art represents animals, and Chauvet is no exception. The artists were highly skilled at using, or even enhancing, the natural shape of the cave walls to give depth and perspective to their drawings. The sense of motion and vitality in these animals, well, wait till I show you the slides. Anyway, most Paleolithic cave art depicts large herbivores. Horses are most common overall, with deer and bison pretty common too. Probably animals they hunted. But earlier, at Chauvet, there's a significant interest in large, dangerous animals. Lots of rhinoceros, lions, mammoths, bears. Remember that the ranges of many animal species were different back then, so all these animals actually lived in the region at that time. But the Chauvet artists didn't paint people. There's a half-man, half-bison creature, and there's outlines of human hands, but no depiction of a full human. So, why these precise animals? Why not birds, fish, snakes? Was it for their religion, magic, or sheer beauty? We don't know. But whatever it was worth it to them to spend hours deep inside a cave with just a torch between them and utter darkness. So, on that note, let's dim the lights so we can see these slides and actually look at the techniques they used.
In this question, you will be asked to talk about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare a response and 45 seconds to record the response. Some students prefer to work on class assignments by themselves. Others believe it is better to work in a group. Which do you prefer? Explain why.
Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a conversation, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. The university's Dining Services Department has announced a change. Read an announcement about this change. You will have 45 seconds to read the announcement. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students discussing the announcement.
Do you believe any of this? It's ridiculous.
What do you mean? Well, it is important to eat healthy foods.
Sure it is, but they're saying yogurt's better for you than an omelet or than hot cereal? I mean, whether something's hot or cold, that shouldn't be the issue. Except maybe on a really cold morning. In that case, which is going to be better for you? A bowl of cold cereal or a nice warm omelet? It's obvious. There's no question.
No, I'm not going to argue with you there.
And this whole thing about saving money.
What about it?
Well, they're actually going to make things worse for us, not better. Because if they start cutting back and we can't get what we want right here on campus, well, we're going to be going off campus and pay off-campus prices. And you know what? That'll be expensive. Even if it's only 2 or 3 mornings a week, it can add up.
The woman expresses her opinion of the change that has been announced. State her opinion and explain her reasons for holding that opinion. Begin to prepare your response after the beep.
Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a talk, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Read the passage from a sociology textbook. You have 50 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture about this topic in a sociology class.
This is a true story from my own life. In my first year in high school, I was addicted to video games. I played them all the time, and I wasn't studying enough. I was failing chemistry. That was my hardest class. So this was a conflict for me because I wanted a good job when I grew up, and I knew that if you want a good career, you gotta do well in school. But I just couldn't give up video games. I was completely torn. And my solution was to change my perspective. See, the only class I was doing really badly in was chemistry. In the others, I was okay. So I asked myself if I wanted to be a chemist when I grew up. And the fact is, I didn't. I was pretty sure I wanted to be a sociologist. So I told myself my chemistry class didn't matter, because sociologists don't really need to know chemistry. In other words, I changed my understanding of what it meant to do well in school. I reinterpreted my situation. I used to think that doing well in school meant doing well in all my classes. But now I decided that succeeding in school meant only doing well in the classes that related directly to my future career. I eliminated the conflict, at least in my mind.
Using the example discussed by the professor, explain what cognitive dissonance is and how people often deal with it. Begin to prepare your response after the beep.
Begin speaking after the beep.
In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture and answer a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor is discussing advertising strategies.
In advertising, various strategies are used to persuade people to buy products. In order to sell more products, advertisers will often try to make us believe that a product will meet our needs or desires perfectly, even if it's not true. The strategies they use can be subtle, friendly forms of persuasion that are sometimes hard to recognize. In a lot of ads, repetition is a key strategy. Research shows that repeated exposure to a message, even something meaningless or untrue, is enough to make people accept it or see it in a positive light. You've all seen the car commercials on TV, like the one that refers to its roomy cars over and over again. You know which one I mean. This guy is driving around and he keeps stopping to pick up different people. He picks up 3 or 4 people, and each time the narrator says, "Plenty of room for friends, plenty of room for family, plenty of room for everybody." The same message is repeated several times in the course of the commercial. Now the car actually looks kind of small. It's not a very big car at all, but you get the sense that it's pretty spacious. You'd think that the viewer would reach the logical conclusion that the slogan misrepresents the product. Instead, what usually happens is that when the statement "plenty of room" is repeated often enough, people are actually convinced it's true. Another strategy they use is to get a celebrity to advertise a product. It turns out that we're more likely to accept an advertising claim made by somebody famous, a person we admire and find appealing. We tend to think they're trustworthy. So you might have a car commercial that features a well-known race car driver. Now, it may not be a very fast car. It could even be an inexpensive vehicle with a low performance rating. But if a popular race car driver is shown driving it and saying, "I like my cars fast," then people will believe the car is impressive for its speed.
Using the examples from the talk, explain how persuasive strategies are used in advertising. Begin to prepare your response after the beep.
Begin speaking after the beep.
Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Everything you just read about Portrait of an Elderly Woman in a White Bonnet is true, and yet, after a thorough re-examination of the painting, a panel of experts has recently concluded that it's indeed a work by Rembrandt. And here's why. First, the fur collar. X-rays and analysis of the pigments in the paint have shown that the fur collar wasn't part of the original painting. The fur collar was painted over the top of the original painting about 100 years after the painting was made. Why? Someone probably wanted to increase the value of the painting by making it look like a formal portrait of an aristocratic lady. Second, the supposed error with light and shadow. Once the paint of the added fur collar was removed, the original painting could be seen. In the original painting, the woman is wearing a simple collar of light-colored cloth. The light-colored cloth of this collar reflects light that illuminates part of the woman's face. That's why the face is not in partial shadow. So in the original painting, light and shadow are very realistic and just what we would expect from Rembrandt. Finally, the wood panel. It turns out that when the fur collar was added, the wood panel was also enlarged with extra wood pieces glued to the sides and the top to make the painting more grand and more valuable. So the original painting is actually painted on a single piece of wood, as would be expected from a Rembrandt painting. And in fact, researchers have found that the piece of wood in the original form of Portrait of an Elderly Woman in a White Bonnet is from the very same tree as the wood panel used for another painting by Rembrandt, his self-portrait with a hat.
Summarize the points made in the lecture, being sure to explain how they answer the specific problems presented in the reading passage.
If I work on a class assignment, I prefer to work on myself better than to work in a group, simply because I like to do things the way I see them. For example, sometimes I've got very particular opinions on a topic, and I really want to express them. If I'm working in a group, I have to adjust to other people's opinions. And I can monitor my time on my own. I'm quite good at that and like to have a very structured approach to things and finish things at certain times. If I always have to rely on other people in a group, things might not be finished at the time I want them to be finished. So I prefer to work on my own.
Both of these assignments have their good things. So first of all, in the group you have different ideas and everybody knows something else from a topic, and you can another point is that you have more time for other things and you don't have to do everything by your own. But alone it's better. You are independent and you can
The woman has the opinion that the whole new food change is pretty ridiculous because she thinks it's no issue if the food is hot or cold in concern of what is healthy or not, because she says on a cold day it's much better to eat something warm like a soup or an omelette instead of yogurt or bread or only some fruits, because when it's cold you could get sick. And she also thinks that there is no chance of saving money in this new program, this new dining service change, because she will go off campus and other students too will go off campus to get food that they like, and that will come more expensive than if they would just stay on the campus and eat the food they would get there. So she has the opinion that the dining change is pretty ridiculous because she would like warm food.
First of all, she thinks that if food is healthy or not doesn't depend on if it's cold or warm. Then she says the difficulty is if the university stops serving hot food in the morning It is like the offer is there are less offer for choosing breakfast, and if it's a cold morning and you come to university and want to eat something hot, you want to warm up, and there's no warm food to eat. That is horrible. Someone might be not able to get used to it. And the last thing she refers to is about the money, that it's very expensive then to go out to eat off campus and buy hot food.
Cognitive dissonance is a conflict between your actions and your beliefs. As a consequence of this conflict, you don't change your actions, but you just change your interpretation of your situation. For example, the lecturer of sociology was addicted to video games in his first university year, and he was bad at chemistry, and he just couldn't give up playing video games, so he said to himself, well, why do I need chemistry? I'm going to be a sociologist. I'm quite bad at chemistry, but it doesn't matter. I just change the perspective and reinterpret the situation, and so everything is okay, and my future is safe.
Cognitive dissonance is when there's a contradiction between actions that people do and their belief. So, for example, if someone is addicted to video games, but he can't stop it, although he's writing really bad marks at school, and he just can't stop it, then he begins to make up his own opinion. For example, that he says that his bad marks in chemistry are not that bad for him because he doesn't want to do anything with chemistry later in life, and so it doesn't really matter what his marks are like. And
the psychology professor presents two techniques employed in advertising strategy meant to send subtle messages to the watching customer, and she underlines these strategies and the techniques employed in them through examples from car advertising. Technique one that she is referring to is repetition of a certain feature of a car, which might cause to believe the car actually has this feature, even though we do not obviously recognize it when seeing the car. In her example, the size. The second technique is to use a celebrity, which we might feel appealing or trustworthy about, which can also transmit a feature of a car to us that we would not perceive ourselves.
Persuasive strategies are used in advertising to improve the reputation. For example, if one method is repeated all the time, for example, lots of your friends have space in it, the listener is convenienced with it. Another strategy is that firm persons are related in their advertising, because we trust the famous persons and we know their faces, and so we believe what they are saying. That's all.
Listen to a conversation between a student and an administrator in the University Employment Office.
Hi, I hope you can help me. I just transferred from Northeastern State University near Chicago.
Well, welcome to Central University. But Chicago's such a great city. Why'd you leave?
Everyone asks that. It's my hometown, and it was sure convenient to go to a school nearby. But Northeastern is still fairly small, and it doesn't have the program I'm interested in. See, I want to major in international studies, and the only program in the state is here.
We do have a great program. Well, how did you get interested in international studies?
Well, my family hosted a few foreign exchange students while I was growing up. Then I took part in an international summer program after I graduated from high school. I found I really liked meeting people from all over, getting to know them.
Oh, okay. And that led you to our program. Right now, though, I assume you're looking for a job.
Yeah, a part-time job on campus. I thought I'd save money, being away from the big city, but it doesn't seem to be working that way. Anyway, I'm not having much luck.
I'm not surprised. Most of our campus jobs are taken in the first week or two of the semester. What work experience have you had?
Well, I worked in the university library last year, but I already checked at the library here. They said their remaining positions were for work-study students getting financial aid. I've never run into that before.
Well, I guess each school has its own policies. We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something, how are your computer skills?
About average, I'd say. I help teach some of the basic computer classes Northeastern offers for new users, if that helps any.
Okay. The Technology Support Department needs people to work at its help desk. It's basically a customer service job. Answering questions, helping people solve their computer problems, give you a chance to develop your people skills.
Something every diplomat needs. But is there some problem? I mean, why is the job still open?
Well, they have extended hours from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. every day, so they need a large staff. But right now, they only need people early mornings, late nights, and weekends. You'd probably end up with a bit of everything rather than a regular spot. On the bright side, you'd probably be able to get some studying done between calls. At least it'd be a start, and then you can try for better hours next semester.
I see where the hours might be a problem. But I guess I can't afford to be too picky if I want a job. Still, maybe we can work something out.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
We really don't have much right now. You might be better off waiting until next semester. If you really want something...
Why does the woman say this?
If you really want something...
Listen to part of a lecture in an art history class.
Today, we'll continue our examination of ancient Roman sculpture. We've already looked at portrait sculpture, which are busts created to commemorate people who had died, and we've looked at relief sculpture, or sculpting on walls. And today, we look at yet another category of sculpture, copies. Roman sculptors often made copies of famous Greek sculptures.
Why did they do that?
Well, no one knows for sure. You see, in the late 4th century BC, the Romans began a campaign to expand the Roman Empire. And in 300 years, they had conquered most of the Mediterranean area and parts of Europe. You know the saying, to the victor belong the spoils? Well, the Roman army returned to Rome with many works of Greek art. It's probably fair to say that the Romans were impressed by Greek art and culture, and they began making copies of the Greek statues. Now, the dominant view in traditional art history is that Roman artists lacked creativity and skill, especially compared to the Greek artists who came before them. Essentially, the traditional view, a view that's been prevalent for over 250 years, is that the Romans copied Greek sculptures because they couldn't create sculpture of their own. But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view. One is Elaine Gazda. Gazda says that there might be other reasons that Romans made copies. She wasn't convinced that it was because of a lack of creativity. Can anyone think of another possible reason?
Well, maybe they just admired the sculptures. They liked the way they looked.
Yes, that's one of Gazda's points. Another is that while nowadays reproduction is easy, it was not so easy in Roman times. Copying statues required a lot of skill, time, and effort. So Gazda hypothesizes that copying didn't indicate a lack of artistic imagination or skill on the part of Roman artists, but rather the Romans made copies because they admired Greek sculpture. Classical Greek statues represented an idealization of the human body and were considered quite beautiful at the time. Gazda also believes that it's been a mistake to dismiss the Roman copies as, copies for copy's sake, and not to consider the Roman function and meaning of the statues.
What do you mean, the Roman function? Weren't they just for decoration?
Well, not necessarily. Under the Emperor Augustus, at the height of the Roman Empire, portrait statues were sent throughout the empire. They were supposed to communicate specific ideas about the emperor and the imperial family, and to help inhabitants of the conquered areas become familiar with the Roman way of life. Roman coins were also distributed throughout the empire. Anybody care to guess what was on them?
The emperor's face?
That's right. The coins were easy to distribute, and they allowed people to see the emperor, or at least his likeness, and served as an additional reminder to let them know, who was in charge. And the images helped people become familiar with the emperor. Statues of him in different roles were sent all over the empire. Now, actually, some Roman sculptures were original, but others were exact copies of Greek statues. And some Roman sculptures were combinations of some sort. Some combined more than one Greek statue, and others combined a Greek god or an athlete with a Roman's head. At the time of Julius Caesar, it wasn't uncommon to create statues that had the body of a god and the head of an emperor. And the Romans were clever. What they did was they made plaster casts from molds of the sculptures. Then they shipped these plaster casts to workshops all over the empire, where they were replicated in marble or bronze. And on some statues, the heads were removable. They could put an emperor's head on different bodies, showing him doing different things. And then later, when the time came, they could even use the head of the next emperor on the same body.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Essentially, the traditional view, a view that's been prevalent for over 250 years, is that the Romans copied Greek sculptures because they couldn't create sculpture of their own. But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view.
What does the professor imply when he says this?
But finally, some contemporary art historians have challenged this view.
Listen to a conversation between a student and his sociology professor.
Well, I'm glad you redid your outline. I've made a few comments, but nothing you have to act on. It's in good enough shape for you to start writing your paper.
Thanks. At first I was afraid all that prep work would be a waste of time.
Well, especially with a challenging topic like yours, factors leading to the emergence of sociology as an academic discipline. There's just so much history to consider, you could get lost without a solid outline. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's about... You mentioned needing volunteers for a research study?
Yep. It's not my study, it's my colleagues in the marketing department. She needs people to watch various new TV programs that haven't been broadcast yet. Then indicate on a survey whether they liked it, why, if they'd watch another episode. It'd be kind of fun. Plus, participants get a $50 gift certificate.
Oh, well, I like the sound of that. But, so they're trying to predict if these shows are going to succeed or fail, right? Based on students' opinions? Why would they care what we think?
Hey, don't sell yourself short. People your age are a very attractive market for advertisers who promote their products on television. The study's sponsored by a TV network. If enough students don't like a show, the network may actually reconsider putting it on the air.
Okay, well, how do I sign up?
You just add your name and phone number to this list and check a time slot. although it looks like the only times left are next Monday morning and Thursday evening.
Oh, well, I have marketing and economics Monday mornings and Thursday.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study. Okay, well, we don't want you missing class. How's Thursday?
Oh, I work from 5 till 9 that night.
No flexibility with your schedule? Where do you work?
At Fox's Diner. I'm a server.
Oh, I love Fox's. I eat there every week. Maybe you could switch shifts with someone.
I'm still in training, and the only night my trainer works is Thursday.
Look, I know the owners there really well. Why don't you let me give them a call and explain the situation?
Okay. It'd be cool to be part of a real research study, and the gift certificate wouldn't hurt either.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big.
Listen to part of a lecture in a European history class.
In order to really study the social history of the Middle Ages, you have to understand the role of spices. Now, this might sound a little surprising, even a little strange, but what seem like little things now were back then actually rather big things. So, first let's define what a spice is. Technically speaking, a spice is part of an aromatic plant that is not a leaf or herb. Spices can come from tree bark, like cinnamon, plant roots, like ginger, flower buds, like cloves. And in the Middle Ages, Europeans were familiar with lots of different spices, the most important being pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, mace, and nutmeg. These spices literally dominated the way Europeans lived for centuries, how they traded, and even how they used their imaginations. So, why this medieval fascination with spices? We can boil it down to 3 general ideas, briefly. 1 was cost and rarity. 2 was exotic taste and fragrance. And 3rd, mysterious origins and kind of mythical status. Now, for cost and rarity, spices aren't native to Europe, and they had to be imported. Spices only grew in the East Indies, and, of course, transportation costs were astronomical. So spices were incredibly valuable, even from the very beginning. Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. By the Middle Ages, spices were regarded as so important and expensive they were used in diplomacy, as gifts by heads of state and ambassadors. Now, for the taste. The diet then was relatively bland compared to today's. There wasn't much variety, especially the aristocracy, who tended to eat a lot of meat. They were always looking for new ways to prepare it, new sauces, new tastes, and this is where spices came in. Now, this is a good point to mention one of the biggest myths about spices. It's commonly said that medieval Europeans wanted spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat, but this isn't really true. Anyone who had to worry about spoiled meat couldn't afford spices in the first place. If you could afford spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. We also have evidence that various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food. And if you were caught doing it, you were subject to various fines, humiliating public punishments. So what actually was true was this. In order to have meat for the winter, people would preserve it in salt, not a spice. Spices actually aren't very effective as preservatives. And throughout winter, they would eat salted meat. But the taste of the stuff could grow really boring and depressing after a while. So the cooks started looking for new ways to improve the taste, and spices were the answer. Which brings us to mysterious origins and mythical status. Now, the ancient Romans had a thriving spice trade, and they sent their ships to the east and back. But when Rome collapsed in the 5th century and the Middle Ages began, direct trade stopped. And so did that kind of hands-on knowledge of travel and geography. Spices now came by way of the trade routes, with lots of intermediaries between the producer and the consumer. So these spices took on an air of mystery. Their origins were shrouded in exotic travels. They had the allure of the unknown, of wild places. Myths grew up of fantasy lands, magical, faraway places made entirely of food and spices. Add to that, spices themselves had always been considered special or magical, not just for eating, and this was already true in the ancient world where legends about spices were abundant. Spices inspired the medieval imagination. They were used as medicines to ward off diseases and mixed into perfumes, incense. They were used in religious rituals for thousands of years. They took on a life of their own, and they inspired the medieval imagination, spurred on the age of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, when famous explorers like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan left Europe in their ships. They weren't looking for a new world. They were looking for spices. And we know what important historical repercussions some of those voyages had.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Why does the professor say this?
And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Well, it's finally looking like spring is arriving. The last of the winter snow will be melting away in a few days. So before we close today, I thought I'd mention a biological event that's part of the transition from winter to spring. Something you can go outside and watch if you have some patience. There's a small creature that lives in this area. You've probably seen it. It's the North American wood frog. Now, the wood frog's not that easy to spot since it stays pretty close to the ground, under leaves and things, and it blends in really well with its background, as you can see. But they're worth the effort because they do something very unusual, something you might not have even thought possible. Okay, North American wood frogs live over a very broad territory, or range. They're found all over the northeastern United States and all through Canada and Alaska, even inside the Arctic Circle. No other frog is able to live that far north. But wherever they live, once the weather starts to turn cold and the temperatures start to drop below freezing, as soon as the frog even touches an ice crystal or a bit of frozen ground, well, it begins to freeze. Yes, Jimmy, you look a little bit taken aback.
Wait, you mean it's still alive, but it freezes? Solid?
Well, almost. Ice forms in all the spaces outside cells, but never within a cell.
But then how does its heart beat?
It doesn't.
But how can
it do such a thing? Well, that first touch of ice apparently triggers a biological response inside the frog that first of all starts drawing water away from the center of its body. So the middle part of the frog, its internal organs, its heart, lungs, liver, these start getting drier and drier, while the water that's being pulled away is forming a puddle around the organs just underneath the skin. And then that puddle of water starts to freeze. Okay, up to now, the frog's heart is still beating, right? Slower and slower, and in those last few hours before it freezes, it distributes glucose, a blood sugar, throughout its body, its circulatory system. Sort of acts like an antifreeze.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
I don't really know, but how long does it stay that way?
Well, it could be days or even months. All winter, in fact. But, see, the heart really doesn't need to do any pumping now because the blood is frozen too.
I guess I just don't see how it isn't, clinically dead.
Well, that's the amazing thing. And how it revives is pretty amazing too. After months without a heartbeat, springtime comes around again, the earth starts to warm up, and suddenly, one day, ping, a pulse, followed by another one, then another, until maybe 10, 12 hours later, the animal is fully recovered.
And does the thawing process have some kind of trigger as well?
Well, we're not sure, actually. The peculiar thing is, even though the sun is warming the frog up on the outside, its insides thaw out first, the heart and brain and everything. But somehow it all just happens that way every spring.
And after they thaw, does it affect them, like their lifespan?
Well, we really don't know a lot about how long a wood frog normally lives, probably just a few years. But there's no evidence that the freezing process affects its longevity. It does have some other impacts, though. In studies, we found that when it comes to reproduction, freezing diminishes the mating performance of males. After they've been frozen, and thawed, of course, they don't seem quite as vocal. They move slower, and they seem to have a harder time recognizing a potential mate. So, if the male frog could manage not to go through this freezing cycle, he'd probably have more success in mating.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Well, you tell me.
In this question, you will be asked to talk about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to prepare a response and 45 seconds to record the response. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It is important to learn about other cultures. Use details and examples to explain your opinion. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a conversation, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. City University's choir is changing its performance schedule next year. Read an article about it in the student newspaper. You will have 50 seconds to read the article. Begin reading now. Now, listen to two students discussing the article.
Jim, you're in the choir, right? What do you think about what they're doing next year? This article.
I really like it.
Yeah?
Yeah, the new director's right that it will motivate us.
How's that?
Well, some of the other schools are really good, so we'll really have to work hard to go up against them.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we don't rehearse more than once a week, But if we know we'd be competing with other schools, we'd probably rehearse more often and improve our singing a lot.
That's true. The more you practice, the better you get. So, what about what the article said about how this will help the program?
I hope it works. Right now, our program is pretty small, but we have some really talented people, and it would be great to attract even more people.
So, how will this plan help?
Well, if we go to these off-campus events and other people hear us and think we're really good, we might be able to get some new students interested in coming to this university to be a part of our music program and perform in our choir concerts.
You're right. I hadn't really thought about that.
The man expresses his opinion about the change described in the article. Briefly summarize the change, then state his opinion about the change, and explain the reasons he gives for holding that opinion. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will read a short passage, listen to a talk, and answer a question about them. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Read a passage about relict behaviors from a biology textbook. You will have 50 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Okay, so a good example of this, found right here in North America, is something an animal called the American pronghorn does. Pronghorns, as you may know, are a kind of deer-like animal. They live out on the open, grassy plains, somewhat in the middle of North America. And they are super fast. Pronghorns are, in fact, noted for being the fastest animal in the Western Hemisphere. Once a pronghorn starts running, zoom! None of its present-day predators, like the bobcat or coyote, can even hope to catch up with it. It's off in a flash. Okay, so why then do pronghorns run so fast? That's the question. Well, it turns out that quite a long time ago, I'm talking tens of thousands of years, things on the grassy plains used to be very different for the pronghorns. Because back then, lions used to live on the plains, chasing and preying upon the pronghorns. And lions, of course, are a very swift-moving mammal, much faster than the bobcat or coyote or other predators that you find on the plains today. But now, however, lions are all extinct in North America. They're no longer a predator of the pronghorn. Tens of thousands of years ago, though, the lions were there, chasing the pronghorns. So, back then, the pronghorn's speed was critical to its survival.
Using the example of the pronghorn and lion, explain the concept of a relict behavior. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. In this question, you will listen to part of a lecture and answer a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare a response and 60 seconds to record the response. Listen to part of a lecture in a business class.
People who are likely to buy a company's product are called target customers. And these target customers influence a company's marketing strategy. In order to develop a marketing strategy, a company will look at certain characteristics of the target customers to decide when and where to advertise, so that they'll reach the target customers most effectively. I'd like to talk to you today about two characteristics of target customers that can influence marketing strategy, specifically age and geographic location of the target customers. Say a company makes toy cars. Who are its target customers? Kids, right? So if the company wants to make sure its television advertising reaches its target customers, it would want to advertise during times when kids are actually watching television, like during children's television shows. That way it can make sure that kids see the advertisements. And that way the company would get people in that age group to go buy toy cars or to ask their parents to buy them at least. Now, another important characteristic to consider is geographic location. Places where the company's target customers live. Think about a company that makes boats. Its target customers are people who own homes near oceans or lakes, places where they can use boats. After all, people who don't live near water don't have much use for boats. So by placing advertisements on signs along the road or on television in cities and towns that are near oceans or lakes, the company would be more likely to reach the target customers for its boats and sell more of them as a result.
Using points and examples from the lecture, explain how the characteristics of target customers influence marketing strategy for products. Begin to prepare your response after the beep. Begin speaking after the beep. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
You've just read about 3 ways to save Torreya taxifolia. Unfortunately, none of these 3 options provides a satisfactory solution. About the first solution, re-establishing Torreya in the same location, that's unlikely to be successful because of what's happening to the coolest, dampest areas within Torreya's microclimate. These areas are being strongly affected by changes in the climate of the larger region. This could be because global warming has contributed to an increase in overall temperatures in the region, or because wetlands throughout Florida have been drained. Either way, many areas across the region are becoming drier. So it's unlikely that Torreya would have the conditions it needs to survive anywhere within its original Florida microclimate. Now, about the second solution, relocating Torreya far from where it currently grows. Well, let's look at what happened when humans helped another tree, the black locust tree, move north to a new environment. When they did this, the black locust tree spread so quickly that it killed off many plants and trees in the new environment. And some of these plants and trees were themselves already in danger of becoming extinct. So assisted migration can have unpredicted outcomes for the new environment. Third, research centers are probably not a solution either. That's because the population of Torreya trees that can be kept in the centers will probably not be able to resist diseases. For a population of trees to survive a disease, it needs to be relatively large and it needs to be genetically diverse. Tree populations in the wild usually satisfy those criteria, but research centers would simply not have enough capacity to keep a large and diverse population of Torreya trees, so trees in such centers will not be capable of surviving diseases in the long term.
Summarize the points made in the lecture being sure to explain how they cast doubt on the specific solutions presented in the reading passage.
I think it is important to learn about other cultures. First of all, it gives you the opportunity to understand your culture better. Then it helps you to understand other people from other cultures better, because if you know the background of their behavior, then it is easier to understand it and not judge it. And in addition to that, if you know other cultures, then you do not offend people, because you know how to behave in certain situations, and you know better how to react on other people's behavior.
Yeah, actually I think it's so important, and it's really significantly will affect my personal life, knowing about new culture and other cultures. It's firstly will make me more open-minded and more tolerant toward others. Then I'm gonna really expand my horizon of thoughts and philosophical ideas, because I'm gonna interact with other backgrounds, and that will really give me the chance to acquire good values from other nations.
The choir is about to change their schedule, because they want to take now some off-campus competition, because the director thinks that students will be more motivated then, because they are get into competition with other choirs. Furthermore, he thinks that the guys then are more or better will do a better performance than before, and probably the program will grow. The student, he actually agrees with all these. Or he thinks that the changes are very good, and he agrees with the opinion of the director, who thinks that they will perform better and they will be more motivated, because he thinks when they are in a competition with other very good choirs, they will practice more often, maybe have more than one rehearsal a week, and he thinks that other students will be attracted when they hear them in off-campus competitions to join the university.
The man we just heard is pretty happy with this change undertook by the director. He states that they currently practice very little, because they don't have very regular rehearsal times. By practicing more in preparation for competitions, they will improve their singing quality at the same time that they can level up their singing proficiency with the current competition in other universities. That way they will also establish a cycle where further improvements will encourage the students to rehearse more and practice more.
Ironic behavior is a behavior or a quality that a creature still shows, although the reasons for having developed that behavior or quality has long disappeared. For example, in the evolution, animals needed to flee from their predators, like the pronghorns had to flee from lions who were preying upon them. Thus, they needed to be very fast and would have to run very fast. But nowadays, the lions are extinct in North America, and the current enemies of the pronghorns, the bobcats, and the coyotes are much slower than the lions used to be. And the pronghorns actually don't need to run that fast anymore, but they still have the ability to do so and still show that behavior.
The concept of relict behavior, based on the example that was given, shows that this can be genetically inherit. Like for the example of the pronghorn, that tens of thousands of years ago they used to be chased by lions. This proves that was inherited to nowadays. When even if now lions are extinct in North America, pronghorn still are the fastest animals on the northern hemisphere, and they inherit the seed, which then was critical for their survival. Now it is just something they just have it. It's not survival for them, but they just have it.
Target customers influence marketing strategy because it answers the question where and when should the company advertise. For example, two major points of target customer is age and geographical location. So knowing the age, for example, of target customer, which is child, you should know where the advertise between the or cartoons that children watch, and this will be the proper time to advertise your toy cars, for example. Knowing the geographical location is also important because, for example, if you're selling a boat, it's important that you sell a boat to people that actually need it, and how you reach it is you try to find where people who need it live. So people who need it mainly live near the rivers or near the water, so they could have use of that. In this way, it's important to know target customers.
Actually, it's influenced the strategies of companies directly because they are the target of the company. So companies usually seek to put their promotions and advertisement as much as might be exposed for the targeted customer. So if they are aiming to buy for kids, they put their advertisement in areas which kids mostly happen to exposed to it. And similar in the example of people who are interested in buying boats, so they are usually advertised in the cost and the costs.